The wind that tore through the settlement of Granite Creek was not merely cold. It was a living, malicious thing that hunted for gaps in the chinking of the log cabins and bit through the thickest wool coats. It was late October in the year 1887, and the sky above the Colorado Territory was the color of a bruised plum, heavy with the promise of snow that would soon bury the high passes. Granite Creek sat precariously on the edge of the civilized world, a collection of weather-beaten structures huddled against the spine of the mountains. The streets were a churned mess of half-frozen mud and horse manure, stiffening as the sun dipped behind the jagged peaks to the west. The town smelled of wood smoke, unwashed bodies, and the stale beer that drifted from the swinging doors of the Lucky Strike saloon. It was a hard place for hard people, where mercy was as scarce as gold in the riverbed and judgment was passed as quickly as a bottle of whiskey. On this particular Tuesday, the biting wind carried the sound of approaching hoofbeats. It was not the rhythmic clatter of the stagecoach, nor the solitary plodding of a prospector's mule. It was the heavy, thundering cadence of a team of thoroughbreds, pulling a carriage that was far too fine for the rutted tracks of Granite Creek. The townsfolk, sensing a spectacle, began to drift out of the general store and the saloon. They pulled their collars up against the chill, their breath puffing out in white clouds. Among them was the sheriff, a man named Brody who wore his badge like a burden, and the shopkeeper, Thomas Miller, who stepped out onto the boardwalk wiping his hands on a stained apron. Thomas looked anxious. He knew that carriage. It belonged to Silas Vance, 6 months ago. The sight of Silas Vance's carriage had been a cause for celebration. It had carried Thomas's daughter, Ilara, away to the sprawling Circle Vi Ranch, 50 miles east on the rolling prairie. Ilara had been the envy of every girl in the territory, 22 years old, fair-haired, and married to the wealthiest cattle baron within 3 days' ride. The town had toasted her fortune. They had whispered that Thomas Miller had secured his family's future with such a match. Now, as the carriage slewed to a halt in front of Miller's dry goods, the silence that fell over the street was heavy and suffocating. Silas Vance sat on the driver's bench, wrapped in a buffalo hide coat that cost more than most men earned in a year. His face, handsome in a sharp, predatory way, was twisted into a scowl that darkened his eyes to the color of flint. But it was not Silas who drew the collective gasp of the crowd. It was the figure slumped on the seat beside him. Ilara Vance sat motionless. She was not wearing the silk and lace she had left in. She was dressed in a rough, oversized work shirt that hung off her frame and a skirt that was torn at the hem. A gray wool shawl was wrapped tight around her shoulders, but it could not hide the truth. Her face, once bright with the naive hope of a bride, was a map of violence. A dark, purple bruise bloomed across her left cheekbone, swelling the eye shut. Her lip was split and scabbed. She stared at the dashboard of the wagon, her eyes fixed on nothing, her posture that of a dog that has been kicked until it no longer knows how to run. Silas did not help her down. He jumped from the bench, his boots splashing into the freezing mud, and threw the reins at the hitching post with a violence that made the horses toss their heads. "Get her down!" Silas barked, his voice carrying over the wind. Thomas Miller stood frozen on the boardwalk, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish. Martha, his wife, pushed past him, her hands flying to her mouth as she saw her daughter. "Ilara?" Martha whispered, the word strangled by horror. Silas marched up the steps, his spurs jingling with an arrogant chime. "I am returning her, Miller. She is of no use to me. I want the dowry back, and I want it today." The town gathered closer, forming a tight, voyeuristic semicircle. They were like wolves circling a wounded elk, curiosity warring with revulsion. They whispered behind their hands. 6 months. They murmured. She didn't last the winter. Thomas Miller found his voice, though it shook with a mixture of fear and dawning shame. "You cannot mean that. Mr. Vance, you took vows before God. What has happened to her face?" Silas sneered, turning to look at his wife, who still sat in the wagon, shivering uncontrollably. "She is clumsy. She falls. She is weak. Thomas, I needed a wife who could run a household, who could bear sons, who had some spine. I bought myself a mule that refuses to pull." He did not say he beat her. He did not have to. The truth was written in the way Alara flinched when Silas raised his hand to point at her. Alara sat in the wagon, but her mind was 50 miles away, trapped in the cold, echoing hallway of the ranch house. She remembered the first time. It had been over a spilled cup of coffee. She had apologized, laughing nervously, thinking it a small thing. The back of his hand had caught her so fast she hadn't seen it coming. The shock had been worse than the pain. She remembered lying on the floor, looking up at him, waiting for the apology, waiting for him to say it was a mistake. Instead, he had looked at her with cold curiosity and told her to clean it up. That had been the beginning. The prairie had been a prison. No neighbors for miles. Just the wind, the cattle, and Silas. She had learned to walk softly, to speak only when spoken to make herself small. But small was never enough. If the dinner was cold, if the fire burned too low, if she looked at him the wrong way, the punishment came. And now, here she was, returned. Thomas Miller stepped down into the mud, his face flushing red. You cannot simply bring her back like a sack of flour. Silas, we have a contract. The dowry money it is invested in the store stock. I do not have $500 to hand you this instant. Then sell the stock, Silas spat, or sell the store. I do not care. I will not keep damaged goods in my house. The words hung in the cold air. Damaged goods. Alara heard them. They echoed in the hollow space where her heart used to beat. She felt a phantom pain in her ribs, which were taped beneath her shirt, cracked 3 weeks ago when he had kicked her for weeping. She looked up slowly, meeting the gaze of the town. She saw Mrs. Gable, the baker's wife, turn her head away in embarrassment. She saw the men assessing her, not with pity, but with a cold calculation, wondering what she had done to deserve such a state. She felt dirty. She felt as if the shame were a physical layer of grime on her skin that no amount of scrubbing could remove. She was a failure, a woman who could not please her husband, a daughter who had cost her father his fortune. Standing at the back of the crowd, leaning against the rough-hewn support beam of the livery stable, was a man who did not whisper. Elias Kincaid was a shadow in the town, a man who belonged to the high timber and the rock scree rather than the muddy streets. He was a giant of a man, standing over 6 feet tall, with shoulders that strained the seams of his buckskin jacket. His beard was thick and dark, peppered with premature gray, and his hair hung long to his collar. He was a trapper, a hunter who came down from the mountains only twice a year to trade furs for flour, coffee, and gunpowder. The townspeople gave Elias a wide berth. Rumors clung to him like burrs. They said he had killed a man in Wyoming with his bare hands. They said he had lived with the Ute people and forgotten how to be a Christian. They said he was half savage, more bear than human. Elias watched the scene unfold with eyes that were the color of mossy river stones. He did not blink. He saw the way the girl, Alara, trembled. He saw the way her fingers, blue with cold, gripped the frayed wool of her shawl so tightly that the knuckles were white. He saw the terror in her posture, a terror he had seen in trapped wolves before he put them out of their misery. His jaw tightened. The muscles in his neck corded. He had no love for Silas Vance. Vance was a man who fenced off the open range and poisoned wolves with strychnine, killing everything else that ate the carcass. But this was a cruelty that went beyond greedy land grabbing. Silas Vance was shouting now, his voice echoing off the wooden storefronts. "She is barren! Miller! 6 months and no sign of a child! She is dry as a dead creek bed! And she is disobedient! I told her to stay in the house, and she wandered the hills like a damned fool! She is wild in the head and useless in the body! Father," Alara whispered. It was the first sound she had made. It was a broken, raspy sound. "Please." Thomas Miller looked at his daughter, then back at the wealthy rancher. The pressure of the town's eyes was crushing him. He was a proud man, but he was a weak one. He owed the bank. He owed the suppliers. The $500 Silas had given as a dowry had saved them from ruin. And now, he had no way to pay it back. "Silas, please," Thomas pleaded, his voice dropping. "Let us discuss this inside. Do not shame us in the street." "There is nothing to discuss," Silas said, crossing his arms. "You sold me a bill of goods that was false. I am returning the merchandise. You have until sundown to get my money, or I take the deed to this store." He gestured vaguely at the wagon. "And take her out of my sight. She makes me sick to look at." Elara flinched. The movement was small, a sharp jerk of her head, but Elias saw it. It was the reaction of a creature expecting a blow. The sheriff, Brody, shifted his weight uncomfortably. He chewed on a toothpick, looking at the ground. Silas Vance owned half the county's debt. Brody wasn't going to step in between a man and his wife, or a man and his father-in-law. It was a domestic matter. That was how the law saw it. Elara tried to stand. Her legs, stiff from the cold and the long ride, gave way. She stumbled, catching herself on the side of the wagon box. A ripple of laughter went through the back of the crowd, some drunkard from the saloon finding the clumsy display amusing. Elara's face burned. The heat of the humiliation was more painful than the freezing wind. She wished, with a desperate, frantic intensity, that the ground would open up and swallow her whole. She wished she had died on the prairie. She remembered the night she had run out into the snow, barefoot, just to get away from his voice. He had dragged her back by her hair. She looked at her father. Thomas looked away. He looked at the ground, at his boots, at the store sign. He did not look at her. She was alone. The mountain man pushed himself off the beam of the livery stable. The sound of his boots on the boardwalk was heavy, a slow, deliberate rhythm that cut through the murmuring crowd. Elias Kincaid did not walk like the townspeople, who hurried and scurried against the cold. He moved with the conserving economy of a predator. The crowd parted for him. They moved not out of politeness, but out of instinct. He smelled of pine resin, old leather, and wood smoke. Elias stopped at the bottom of the muddy steps, placing himself between Thomas Miller and Silas Vance. He towered over the rancher. "What is the quarrel here?" Elias asked. His voice was deep, a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in the timber of the porch. It was not loud, but it carried authority. Silas Vance looked up, his lip curling in disgust. "This is none of your concern. Trapper, get back to your furs." Elias did not move. He turned his head slowly, ignoring Silas, and looked up at the wagon. He looked directly at Elara. For the first time in 6 months, a man looked at her and did not look through her, nor did he look at her with greedy possession. Elias looked at the bruise on her cheek. He looked at the way her wrist was swollen where the sleeve of the shirt rode up. He looked at her eyes. Elara froze. The mountain man's gaze was intense, uncomfortably direct, but there was no mockery in it. He looked at her as if he were assessing the damage to a sapling after a storm, solemnly, quietly. "You hurt her," Elias said. It was not a question. Silas bristled. "I disciplined my wife. That is my right. And she is not my wife anymore. She is her father's problem." Elias turned back to Silas. The air between them seemed to crackle. "You speak of her like she is a horse with a broken leg. She is worth less than a horse." Silas laughed, a sharp, barking sound. "A horse can work. A horse can breed. This one? She is damaged goods. Look at her. She is scared of her own shadow. She shakes if you raise your voice. Who would want that? She is ruined. Ruined." The word hung there. Elara felt tears, hot and stinging, spill over her lashes. They tracked through the dust on her face. She closed her eyes, accepting the verdict. He was right. She was broken. She was 22 and her life was over. Elias Kincaid looked at Silas. Then he looked at the shivering woman in the wagon. He felt a familiar heat rising in his chest, a dark anger that he usually kept buried under miles of snow and silence. He knew what it was to be cast out. He knew what it was to be looked at with disgust. But looking at Elara, he did not see ruin. He saw endurance. He saw a woman who had survived a monster and was still drawing breath. "If you do not want her," Elias said, his voice dropping to a register that was almost a growl. "Then I will take her." The silence that followed was absolute. The wind whistled through the eaves of the general store. Thomas Miller's head snapped up. "What?" Silas blinked, then a slow, incredulous grin spread across his face. "You, the savage of the peaks? You want to take her?" Elias did not look at the crowd. He kept his eyes on Silas. "I said I will take her. You say she is broken. You say she has no value. Fine, leave her be." Thomas Miller sputtered, stepping forward. "Now see here, Kincaid. This is my daughter. She is not a stray dog to be picked up in the street." Silas held up a hand, silencing Thomas. "Wait, Miller. Think about it." He turned to Elias, his eyes gleaming with malice. "You want her? You can have her. But I want my dowry, $500. "I do not have $500, Elias said calmly. "Then she stays here, and Miller pays me, or I take the store." Thomas Miller looked at his wife, then at the menacing figure of his son-in-law. He looked at the terrified face of his daughter. He was trapped. If he kept her, Silas would ruin them. They would be homeless by winter. And Alara, who would marry her now? A divorced woman? A woman publicly returned and branded as barren and beaten? She would be a pariah. She would be a burden on them for the rest of their lives. "Kincaid," Thomas said, his voice trembling. You would marry her? Legally?" Elias nodded once. "Legally." The crowd began to whisper furiously. "The mountain man, with Miller's girl, she won't last a week up there. He'll eat her alive." Silas laughed again, a cruel, victorious sound. He slapped his thigh. "Well, that solves it. A trade. You take the damaged goods off my hands, and I will forgive the debt. Miller, I get rid of the wife. You keep your store, and the trapper gets a warm body for his bed. Everyone wins." He looked up at Alara, sneering. "You hear that? Alara, you have a new master. Maybe he will beat some sense into you, though I doubt he has a gentle hand." Alara felt bile rise in her throat. She gripped the wagon seat. They were trading her, like a cow, like a sack of grain. Her father was actually considering it. She looked at Thomas, begging him with her eyes to stop this, to take her inside, to protect her. But Thomas looked down. I cannot lose the store. Martha," he whispered to his wife, "we would starve." He looked at Elias. "If you marry her, Kincaid, if you take her away and she is provided for, then the debt is cleared?" Silas nodded. "Cleared. I wash my hands of the whole Miller clan." Alara felt the world tilt. She was being sold, again. And this time to a man who looked like he carved his meat with a Bowie knife and slept in the snow. A man the town whispered was violent. Elias stepped toward the wagon. He moved past Silas without acknowledging him. He walked through the mud until he was standing right beside the front wheel, looking up at Alara. Up close, he was even larger. His beard was tangled, his face weathered by sun and wind, but his eyes were clear. He saw the panic in her. He saw the way she recoiled, pressing herself back against the seat. He reached up. He did not grab her. He held his hand out, palm up, steady and waiting. A massive, calloused hand that could crush a throat or skin a beaver. Silas called out from the boardwalk. "You are getting a bad deal, trapper. She is scarred up and useless. Look at her. She is damaged." Elias did not withdraw his hand. He kept his eyes locked on Alara's. He spoke, and his voice was rough with a sincerity that cut through the cold wind like a hot knife. "He is wrong," Elias said. "He spoke to her, not the crowd." Alara stopped breathing. She looked into the moss-green eyes and saw no deception there. "She is not damaged to me," Elias said, his voice rising just enough for the town to hear, for the father to hear, for Silas to hear. He looked at her bruises, her torn lip, the terror in her soul. He saw the strength it took just to sit there and not scream. "She is perfect to me." The words hung in the air, defiant and absolute. "She is perfect to me." Alara felt a shock go through her, a jolt that started in her chest and tingled in her fingertips. It was not love. She did not know this man. It was confusion. It was disbelief. But beneath that, a tiny, flickering warmth. Someone had stood between her and the wolves. Someone had looked at her wreckage and called it perfect. Silas stopped laughing. The smile fell from his face. He looked at Elias with a sudden, sharp hatred. The mountain man had robbed him of his victory. He had taken the insult and turned it into a shield. "Well," Silas spat, "take her then. Get her out of here." Elias waited. He kept his hand out. "Come," he said softly to Alara. Alara looked at her parents. Her mother was weeping silently into a handkerchief. Her father looked relieved, ashamed, and exhausted. They were not going to help her. They were letting her go to save themselves. She looked at Silas. He was watching her with cold amusement, waiting for her to beg. Then she looked at Elias. His hand was still there. He hadn't moved. He wasn't demanding. He was asking. The choice was terrible. Stay and be the town's shame, the daughter who ruined her family, perhaps dragged back to Silas eventually by the law or necessity. Or go into the mountains, into the high, deadly wilderness, with a stranger. But the stranger had called her perfect. Alara moved. Her body was stiff and aching. She slid across the seat. She reached out, her hand trembling violently. She placed her small, pale hand into Elias's massive, rough palm. His fingers closed over hers. Not tight, just secure, a warm, solid grip. He took her weight as she stepped down from the wagon. Her legs buckled when she hit the mud, and he caught her. He did not grab her arm roughly as Silas did. He caught her by the waist, his arm like an iron bar, holding her up until she found her footing. He smelled of pine and wildness, but there was no smell of whiskey on him. "Can you walk?" he asked quietly. Alara nodded, though she wasn't sure. "Yes." Elias turned to Thomas Miller. "Have the preacher at the church in 1 hour. We will do this right." He did not wait for an answer. He turned his back on Silas Vance, on the gaping crowd, and on the parents who had failed their daughter. He kept his hand on Alara's elbow, guiding her, not dragging her, toward the livery stable where his own horse and pack mule were waiting. Alara walked beside him, her head down, the mud sucking at her thin shoes. She did not look back at the carriage. She felt the eyes of the town on her back, burning like brands. She was walking away from the only life she knew, walking toward a life of snow and silence. She was terrified, but as the wind howled down the street, stinging her wounded face, she realized one thing. For the first time that day, she was not shivering. The large man beside her was blocking the wind. The hour passed in a blur of gray light and hushed urgency. The church was a drafty, wooden building that smelled of damp wool and old hymnals. The stained glass was simple, just colored geometric shapes that rattled in their lead frames as the gale picked up outside. Reverend Hayes was a nervous man with thin spectacles who seemed eager to get the business over with. He looked from the bruised woman to the towering mountain man and swallowed hard. Thomas and Martha Miller stood in the front pew as witnesses. Martha was still crying. Thomas stared at the altar, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Sheriff Brody stood by the door, arms crossed, ensuring the legalities were observed so the debt could be cleared. Silas Vance was not there. He had retired to the saloon, doubtless to drink to his financial acumen. Elias stood at the altar. He had removed his heavy coat, revealing a flannel shirt and a buckskin vest. He washed his hands in a basin by the door before approaching the rail, scrubbing the dirt from his skin. It was a small gesture, but Alara noticed. She stood beside him. She felt small, fragile. The pain in her ribs was a dull throb. "Do you, Elias Kincaid, take this woman?" the Reverend began. Elias looked down at her. Up close, his face was a landscape of lines and weather. He looked older than she had thought, perhaps nearing 40, but his eyes were young, clear and sharp. "I do," Elias said. His voice filled the empty space of the church. "And do you, Alara Vance?" The Reverend paused, correcting himself. "Alara Miller. Take this man." Alara hesitated. The silence stretched. She looked at the wooden cross on the wall. She thought of the high mountains, the stories of wolves, the cold that could freeze a person solid in an hour. She thought of the man standing next to her, who carried a knife at his belt and whose hands were scarred from traps. Then she thought of Silas's laugh. "Damaged goods, I do," she whispered. It was done. The papers were signed. Thomas Miller signed with a shaking hand, officially transferring his daughter and her burden to the trapper. As they stepped out of the church, the sun had fully set. The twilight was blue and freezing. The wind had died down slightly, replaced by a heavy stillness that meant snow was imminent. Elias's wagon, a sturdy, unpainted thing pulled by two shaggy mules, was waiting. It was loaded with sacks of flour, boxes of ammunition, and rolled hides. Elias lifted her onto the bench. He moved around and climbed up beside her. He picked up a heavy buffalo robe from the back and draped it over her, tucking it in around her legs. "Keep covered," he said. "The wind gets sharper as we climb." He took the reins. He did not look at her parents. He clicked his tongue, and the mules leaned into the harness. The wagon lurched forward, the wheels grinding in the frozen mud. As they passed the saloon, the doors swung open. Silas Vance stepped out, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He leaned against the post, watching them pass. He raised his glass in a mocking toast. "Good luck with the scrap, mountain man." Elias did not turn his head. He did not slow the mules, but Alara saw his hands tighten on the leather reins until the leather creaked. He stared straight ahead, toward the dark, looming shapes of the mountains. "Don't listen," Elias said. His voice was low, meant only for her. "I'm not," Alara lied. The words still stung. They rolled past the last house of Granite Creek. The lights of the town faded behind them, swallowed by the curve of the valley. The road ahead was nothing but a shadow cutting through the pine trees. Alara sat stiffly under the buffalo robe. She was married to a stranger. She was heading into the wilderness. She had no idea if she would survive the winter, or if she had simply traded one hell for another. But as the wagon began the long, slow climb into the dark, she remembered the way he had stood before the town. "She is perfect to me." She stole a glance at him. Elias was watching the road, his profile etched against the stars. He sensed her looking and glanced briefly at her. He didn't smile, but he nodded, a single, reassuring dip of his chin. "Rest," he said. "It is a long way home." Alara pulled the robe tighter around her chin. She closed her eyes, the rhythm of the wagon wheels lulling her into a restless, exhausted doze, as they left the world of men behind and ascended into the wild. The heavy oak door of the Miller home slammed shut, cutting off the biting wind that howled down the main street of Granite Creek. But it could not shut out the heavy, suffocating silence that filled the parlor. The air inside smelled of stale potpourri and the sharp, metallic tang of fear. Thomas Miller paced the rug, his boots leaving faint muddy impressions on the woven wool. His face was a mask of conflict, flushed red with humiliation yet pale around the mouth with relief. Martha Miller sat in a rocking chair by the cold hearth, her hands twisting a handkerchief until the fabric threatened to tear. Alara sat on a hard-backed wooden chair in the corner, her body angled away from them. She felt less like a daughter and more like a ghost that had wandered into the wrong house. Her ribs throbbed with a dull, grinding ache every time she took a breath, a physical reminder of the husband she had just been absolved of. "He is a savage," Martha whispered, her voice trembling. "A wild man. Thomas, he lives with wolves. He kills with his bare hands. You heard the stories. And you are giving her to him?" Thomas stopped pacing and turned on his wife, his voice rising in a desperate defensive snap. "What choice did I have? Martha, did you have $500 hidden in the flour jar? Silas would have taken the store. He would have turned us out into the snow before the week was out. And Alara—" He gestured vaguely at his daughter, refusing to look at her bruised face. Silas was done with her. He made that clear. Would you have her dragged to the asylum or jail? Because that is where Silas Vance puts things he no longer wants. But the mountain man, Martha sobbed. He is distinctly strange. They say he does not speak for months at a time. They say he is half animal. At least he has not hit her, Thomas shouted, then lowered his voice. Glancing at Alara, he lowered his hand. He stepped between her and Silas. That is more than I did. That is more than any man in this God-forsaken town did. Alara closed her eyes. The argument washed over her, distant and muffled, like the sound of water when one is submerged in a river. They were talking about her survival, yet they spoke of her as a burden to be shifted, a debt to be refinanced. She stood up. The movement was slow and stiff, drawing a sharp intake of breath as her side seized up. Her parents stopped talking and looked at her. "I will go," she said. Her voice was raspy, unused. "I will marry him." It was not courage that drove her. It was exhaustion. She was too tired to be ashamed anymore. She was too tired to be the cause of her parents' ruin. "Go to bed, Ilara," her mother said, wiping her eyes. We will pack your trunk in the morning." The night that followed was an eternity carved out of shadows and wind. Alara lay in the narrow bed of her childhood room, staring at the cracked plaster of the ceiling. The quilt was heavy, but she could not get warm. The cold seemed to be radiating from inside her bones. She did not sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Silas's face, twisted in that sneering, superior smile. She felt the phantom impact of his ring against her cheekbone. She heard the crunch of snow under his boots as he walked toward her while she cowered in the corner of the ranch kitchen. But then, the memory would shift. The image of the mountain man would intrude. Elias Kincaid. She remembered the size of him, a wall of buckskin and muscle blocking out the sun. She remembered the rough texture of his voice when he said the words that had stopped the world. "She is perfect to me." Alara turned over, grimacing as pain shot through her torso. Why had he said that? It was a lie, surely. A mockery? No, he had not sounded mocking. He had sounded angry, yes, but the anger was directed at Silas. When he looked at her, his eyes had been quiet. That was the only word for it. Quiet, like a deep pool of water that did not judge the stone thrown into it. She touched her own face in the dark, tracing the swollen contour of her eye, the split in her lip. She was damaged. She knew it. She was broken goods, returned to the sender. So what did he see? Was he blind? Or was he simply so desperate for a woman that even a broken one would do? The thought terrified her. If he wanted her that badly, what would he expect in return? She curled into a ball, pulling her knees to her chest, trying to make herself disappear. She had traded a devil she knew for a giant she did not. Morning came with a gray, lifeless light that offered no warmth. The wind had died down, but the air remained thin and biting. The wedding was held in the small clapboard church at the edge of town. It was a hasty, joyless affair. The church was drafty, the wood groaning as the temperature shifted. Only the preacher, Reverend Hayes, her parents, and Sheriff Brody were present. The sheriff stood by the door, arms crossed, tapping his foot as if waiting for a train. Elias was already there when they arrived. He had clearly not slept either. He stood near the altar, still wearing his buckskin coat, his hair tied back with a leather thong. He looked out of place in the house of God, too large and too wild for the confined space. When Alara walked down the short aisle, clutching her mother's arm, Elias turned. He did not smile. He watched her approach with that same intense, unblinking gravity. Her father handed her over, his hand damp and shaking. He mumbled something about being a good wife, but Alara did not hear him. She was looking at Elias's hands. They were resting on the altar rail, large and scarred, the fingernails clean but short, hands that could snap a neck, hands that had offered to take her. "We are gathered here," Reverend Hayes began, rushing the words, "to join this man and this woman." The vows were spoken in low murmurs. When it was Elias's turn, he did not look at the preacher. He turned his body fully toward Alara. He looked down at her, forcing her to meet his gaze. Elias, take you. Ilara," he said. His voice rumbled in his chest, deep enough to be felt in the floorboards, to have and to hold, to keep from harm. He added that last part. It wasn't in the book. To keep from harm. Alara's breath hitched. She looked at his moss-green eyes and saw a promise there that terrified her because she wanted so desperately to believe it. Alara, take you, Elias, she whispered. Her voice shook, brittle as dry leaves. To be your wife. She did not promise to love. She could not. She did not have any love left to give. It had been beaten out of her. She promised to survive. She promised to try. The ring he slid onto her finger was plain gold, wide and heavy. It had likely been traded for furs, or perhaps it had belonged to a mother he never spoke of. It was warm from his pocket. "It is done," the Reverend said, snapping his book shut. They walked out of the church into the blinding white light of the morning. The town was waking up. Shutters were opening. People were watching from windows. And there, sitting on his black stallion in the middle of the street, was Silas Vance. He was dressed for riding, his coat impeccable, his hat pulled low. He was waiting for them. As Alara and Elias stepped onto the porch, Silas smiled. It was a smile that didn't reach his eyes. A lovely ceremony. Silas called out, "Brief, fitting for a transaction of damaged stock." Elias stopped. He placed a hand on Alara's shoulder, not to hold her back, but to steady her. She was trembling so hard her teeth threatened to chatter. Silas trotted his horse a few steps closer. "Be careful with her. Kincaid, she breaks easily, but then, I suppose you are used to rough things. One man's trash is another man's treasure. Is that it?" The mountain man slowly descended the steps. He moved with a terrifying, fluid grace for a man of his size. He walked until he was standing by the shoulder of Silas's horse. The stallion pinned its ears back, sensing the threat. But Elias ignored the beast. He looked up at Silas. "You have said your piece." "Vance," Elias said. His voice was not a shout. It was a flat, dead thing, devoid of emotion. Silas sneered, reaching for his reins. "I'm just giving you advice. Trapper." He reached out, faster than Alara could follow, and grabbed the bridle of the horse. The animal jerked, but Elias held it fast with one hand, his arm locking like iron. With his other hand, he pointed a finger at Silas's chest. "You are done with her. You threw her away. If I ever see you near her again, if I ever see your shadow cross her path, I will not bring the law. I will bring the mountain. Do you understand me?" The threat was vague, but the delivery was specific. It promised a violence that would leave no trace. Silas paled slightly. He yanked the reins, pulling the horse back. Elias let go, and the horse reared, almost unseating the rancher. "You threaten me?" Silas shouted, fighting for control of his mount. "In front of the sheriff?" Sheriff Brody, leaning in the church doorway, suddenly found the toe of his boot very interesting. "I didn't hear a threat. Mr. Vance, I heard a warning. Best you ride on." Silas glared at them. His pride stung, but the look in Elias's eyes made him hesitate. He spurred his horse, kicking up a spray of mud, and galloped away down the street, shouting something about savages and fools that the wind tore away. Elias watched him go until he was a speck against the prairie. Then he turned back to Alara. "Are you ready?" he asked. Alara nodded. She felt hollowed out, but the trembling had stopped. Yes, their wagon was waiting. It was a sturdy, utilitarian vehicle, the bed piled high with sacks of flour, beans, coffee, sugar, and rounds of ammunition. There were traps, coils of rope, and a few crates of what looked like tools. It was a wagon packed for a siege, or for a long, deep silence. Elias helped her up, his hands impersonal and efficient. He climbed up beside her and snapped the reins. The mules leaned into the collars, and they began to roll. They left Granite Creek without looking back. The muddy streets gave way to a hard-packed dirt road, which in turn dissolved into a rocky trail winding up into the foothills. The air grew thinner with every mile. The trees changed from scrub oak to towering ponderosa pines, their needles dark and green against the snow that blanketed the higher slopes. The silence between them was vast. Elias did not try to fill it with idle chatter. He seemed content to let the rhythm of the wheels and the creak of the leather harness speak for him. He sat relaxed, his body swaying with the motion of the wagon, his eyes constantly scanning the ridgelines and the tree line. Elara sat rigid, her hands clasped in her lap. She felt the distance from town stretching out behind her like a rubber band, pulling tighter and tighter. Every mile took her further from the only world she understood, even if that world had been cruel, and deeper into a wildness she did not know how to navigate. The road narrowed. To their left, the mountain rose in a sheer wall of granite. To their right, the ground fell away into a canyon where a river churned, half frozen and black. Elias stopped the wagon suddenly. Elara gasped, clutching the seat. "What is it?" "Look," Elias said softly. He pointed across the canyon to a rocky outcropping. Elara followed his finger. At first, she saw nothing but rock and snow. Then, movement. A herd of elk was moving through the deep powder, their breath pluming in the air. A massive bull elk with antlers like tree branches paused, looking back at them. "They are moving to the lower valley for the winter," Elias said. "The wolves will be following them." "Wolves," Elara whispered, fear spiking in her chest. Elias looked at her, and his expression softened just a fraction. "They will not bother us. They have easier prey. I just wanted you to see. It is clean up here. The air is clean." He was trying to comfort her. He was trying to give her something other than her own pain to look at. "It is beautiful," she admitted, though the beauty was sharp and intimidating. They continued. The sun began to dip behind the peaks, casting long, purple shadows across the snow. The temperature plummeted. Elara pulled her shawl tighter, but the cold seemed to seep through the wool. "We will camp here," Elias announced as they reached a small clearing beside a creek that was choked with ice. He worked quickly, unhitching the mules and setting up a windbreak with a canvas tarp. He built a fire with practiced ease, striking a spark to dry tinder and nursing it into a roaring blaze within minutes. Elara stood by the wagon, feeling useless. At the ranch, she had been expected to cook, clean and sew, but out here, she felt like a child. I can help with the food," she stammered, her teeth chatting. Elias looked up from the fire. "Sit, warm yourself. I have it." He heated a pan of beans and salt pork, brewing coffee in a battered tin pot. He handed her a plate and a cup, careful not to touch her fingers. "Eat," he said. "You need the heat." They ate in silence. The wind picked up, howling through the pines with a sound like screaming voices. Elara flinched at every gust. The darkness beyond the firelight felt heavy and watching. When it was time to sleep, Elias laid out bedrolls on the ground near the fire. He placed a heavy buffalo robe over one. "That is yours," he said. Elara knelt to arrange it, but her hands were shaking so badly from the cold and the adrenaline dump of the day that she couldn't untie the leather thong holding the blanket roll. She fumbled with it, frustration rising in her throat, threatening to turn into tears. "Here," Elias said. He was beside her. He knelt down, his large presence blocking the wind. He reached out to take the leather thong. As he did, the back of his hand brushed against her fingers. It was a fleeting touch, barely a second, but the shock of it went through Elara like a lightning strike. His skin was rough, warm, and alive. It was not the cold, clammy touch of Silas. It was the heat of a living thing. She jerked her hand back as if burned. Elias froze. He did not look at her. He deftly untied the knot, unrolled the bedding, and then stood up and moved away to the other side of the fire, putting 10 feet of distance between them. "Sleep well, Elara," he said, his back to her. She crawled under the heavy furs, still trembling. She squeezed her eyes shut, listening to the wind, listening to the breathing of the man across the fire. She fell into a fitful sleep, but the demons followed her. In her dream, she was back in the kitchen. Silas was there. He was shouting about the coffee. He raised his hand, and it kept growing larger and larger until it blocked out the light. She tried to run, but the floor was made of mud. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The fist came down. "No!" Elara woke with a gasp, sitting bolt upright. She was clutching her throat, tears streaming down her face. Her heart was hammering against her cracked ribs so hard it hurt. For a moment, She didn't know where she was. Then she saw the embers of the fire, and she saw him. Elias was sitting on a log across the fire. He was awake. He was watching her. He held a cup of coffee in his hands. He didn't move toward her. He didn't tell her to be quiet. He didn't look annoyed. He just watched, his face illuminated by the dying red glow of the coals. "Bad dream?" he asked quietly. Ilara nodded, wiping her face with her sleeve, ashamed of her weakness. "Yes." Elias reached for the coffee pot kept warm by the stones. He poured a small amount into a tin cup. He stood up slowly, walked around the fire, and set the cup on a flat rock within her reach. Then he immediately stepped back to his log. "Drink," he said. "It helps the ghost settle." Ilara reached for the cup. The metal was hot. The coffee was bitter and black, but it grounded her. She looked at him over the rim. "You are not sleeping?" she asked, her voice raspy. "I sleep enough," he said. "The wind is changing. Snow is coming heavy tomorrow. We need to be ready to move at first light." He sat there, a silent sentinel. He asked nothing of her. He did not demand she explain the nightmare. He did not demand she stop crying. He simply existed near her, a solid, unthreatening presence. Ilara finished the coffee. For the first time in 6 months, she lay back down and closed her eyes without fearing the person in the room with her. The next 2 days were a blur of white. The snow came as Elias had predicted, a curtain of heavy flakes that turned the world into a seamless blanket of gray and white. The wagon struggled up the inclines. Twice, they had to stop so Elias could clear a fallen branch or lead the mules through a drift. They reached his valley on the afternoon of the 3rd day. It was a hidden place, a narrow slash in the high mountains protected by towering cliffs on 3 sides. A frozen waterfall hung like a chandelier of blue ice at the far end. In the center of the clearing, sheltered by a stand of massive spruce trees, stood the cabin. It was rough-hewn, built of logs as thick as a man's waist. Smoke curled lazily from the stone chimney. It looked small against the scale of the mountains, but to Ilara, it looked like a fortress. Elias pulled the wagon up to the front door. "Home," he said simply. Inside. The cabin was one large room. It was dark, illuminated only by the light from the windows and the fireplace, but it was surprisingly clean. The floor was swept. Bundles of dried herbs hung from the rafters, sage, mint, and others she didn't recognize. There were shelves stacked with jars and tins. In the corner stood a large bed, the frame made of peeled logs, piled high with furs and quilts. Opposite it, near the stove, was a narrow pallet on the floor. Elias carried her trunk inside and set it at the foot of the bed. "That is yours," he said, pointing to the bed. Ilara looked at the bed, then at the pallet. "Where will you sleep?" "The floor," Elias said, as if it were obvious. "I have slept on rocks harder than these floorboards." He turned to her, and his expression was serious. He took off his hat, wringing it in his hands. "Ilara," he said, "listen to me. You are my wife on paper. That keeps the law away. That keeps your father safe. But in this house, you are your own woman. I will not touch you. I will not come into that bed unless you ask me to. Do you understand?" Ilara stared at him. She searched his face for the lie, for the trap. She found none. "I understand," she whispered. "Good. Now, I will put the mules up. There is wood by the stove. Make yourself warm." And just like that, he left her alone in the cabin. The days turned into a routine. A quiet, tentative rhythm established itself between them. Elias was up before dawn, stoking the fire, checking his trap lines, chopping wood with a rhythmic thwack, thwack, thwack that echoed off the cliffs. Ilara took over the inside. She cleaned, though there was little dirt. She cooked, learning to use the cast-iron stove and the limited ingredients. Venison, dried beans, cornmeal. She mended his shirts, her needle flashing in the firelight. She learned the sounds of the cabin, the groan of the roof under the snow, the hiss of the sap in the burning pine logs, the heavy tread of Elias's boots on the porch. At first, she flinched every time the door opened. She would freeze when he walked past her. Elias noticed. He began to announce himself before entering, stomping the snow off his boots loudly. He moved around her in wide arcs, never cornering her, never looming. One evening, a week after they arrived, a blizzard was raging outside. The wind battered the cabin, but inside, it was warm. The smell of venison stew filled the room. They sat at the small table, eating by the light of a kerosene lamp. The silence was comfortable, lacking the tension of the early days. "This is good," Elias said, nodding at his bowl. "You have a way with spices." "Thank you," Elara said, looking down. It was the first compliment she had received in a year that didn't have a barb attached to it. She looked up and caught him watching her. He wasn't looking at her face. He was looking at her hands. She was holding her spoon. Her fingers curled delicately around the handle. Her hands were healing, the swelling gone, though the skin was still red from the cold water. "What is it?" she asked, self-conscious. "Your hands," Elias said quietly. "They are strong, but they are gentle. I have forgotten what gentle looks like." Elara felt a heat rise in her chest that had nothing to do with the stove. It was a slow, confused flush. She looked at his hands, scarred, stained with oil and earth, resting on the table. They continued eating. As Elara shifted her weight, her knee bumped against his under the small table. Her instinct was to jerk back, to apologize, to brace for a kick. She froze, her breath catching. Elias did not move his leg. He went on eating, steady and calm. He let the contact remain for a second, 2 seconds, 3. It was a solid, warm pressure. Then, slowly, he shifted his foot, breaking the contact, but he did it without haste. "Excuse me," he murmured. Elara looked at him. He was focused on his stew, but she saw a tightness in his jaw, a pulse beating in his temple. He felt it too. Later that night, Elara sat by the fire, mending a tear in her skirt. Elias was cleaning his rifle on the other side of the room. She watched him from beneath her lashes. She watched the way his broad shoulders moved, the focus in his eyes. He was a dangerous man. She knew that. He could kill, but he used his danger like a shield, standing between her and the world. He stood up to put the rifle away, moving quickly toward the rack. Elara, lost in thought, flinched as his shadow fell over her. She pulled her arms in, a reflex she couldn't control. Elias stopped instantly. He took a full step back. He held his hands up, palms open. "I am sorry," he said softly. "I moved too fast." Elara looked at him, seeing the regret in his eyes. He wasn't angry that she was afraid. He was sorry that he was the cause of it. "No," she said, her voice steadying. "No, Elias, I am sorry. I am just—" "You are healing," he finished for her. "It takes time for a trapped animal to trust the hand that frees it." He turned and walked to his pallet, lying down with his back to her. Elara stayed by the fire for a long time. She looked at the empty space beside her, then at the man sleeping on the hard floor. The tight knot of fear that had lived in her chest for months loosened, just a fraction, in its place. A small, glowing ember of awareness began to burn. It was not safe yet, but it was warm. The snow began in November, a relentless, driving force that erased the world. By December, the cabin in the high valley was no longer a dwelling on the earth, but a ship adrift in a white, frozen ocean. The drifts piled halfway up the log walls, banking against the windows until the light inside was always dim and pearlescent, the color of skimmed milk. For 3 weeks, the storm did not break. The wind was a living thing, a shrieking banshee that tore at the shingles and rattled the heavy door on its iron hinges. The temperatures plunged so low that the sap in the pine trees outside froze and cracked with sounds like rifle shots, echoing through the valley. Inside, the world had shrunk to the 20 feet between the hearth and the door. The air smelled of wood smoke, curing leather, and the slow simmering venison stew that sat perpetually on the cast iron stove. The confinement forced a change in the rhythm of the life between Elias Kincaid and Elara. In the autumn, there had been chores to separate them, him to the woodpile, her to the stream. Now, there was nowhere to go. They were trapped in the amber of the firelight, circling each other in the small space. The silence that had once been a shield began to thin. The proximity demanded words. It happened on a Tuesday night, or perhaps a Wednesday. The days had blurred together. The wind was particularly vicious, slamming against the north wall with a violence that made the cabin shudder. Alara was sitting by the fire, mending a tear in one of Elias's heavy wool shirts. Her needle flashed in the orange light. Elias sat opposite her, whittling a trigger mechanism for a trap. He stopped as a gust of wind howled down the chimney, sending a puff of ash into the room. "It sounds like a man screaming," Alara whispered. She did not look up from her sewing, but her hands had stopped moving. Elias looked at her. "It is just the wind. Alara, the mountains make their own music. It sounds like him," she said. She did not say the name, but the name hung between them, heavy and poisonous. "Silas." Elias set his knife down. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. He did not push her. He waited, his presence solid and anchoring. Alara stared into the flames. The memories had been crowding her mind for days, brought on by the feeling of being trapped. The cabin was safe, but the sensation of confinement, of not being able to leave, scratched at the scars in her mind. "He did not just hit me," Alara said. Her voice was flat, detached, as if she were reading a list of supplies. "The hitting was—" I could understand the hitting. It was sharp. It ended. She swallowed, her throat clicking dryly. It was the rest, the way he looked at me across the dinner table, like I was a table leg or a saddle, something that had a function but no soul. Elias remained motionless, but the muscles in his jaw bunched tight. He would come to the room at night. Alara continued. She picked at a loose thread on the shirt. He would smell of brandy and liniment. If I was asleep, he would wake me. If I was crying, he would tell me to stop making noise because he did not like the sound of it. He told me— She paused, her breath hitching. "He told me that a wife is a vessel, that I existed to be used. And when I could not give him a son, when I was too scared to be what he wanted, he said a vessel that cannot hold water is just a broken pot." She finally looked up at Elias. Her eyes were dry, but they held a bleak, terrifying emptiness. "That is why he sent me back. Not because I was beaten, but because he had used me up and found me empty. I was trash to him." Elias felt a rage so pure and white-hot that it momentarily blinded him. He wanted to ride down the mountain, storm through the snow, and tear Silas Vance apart with his hands. He wanted to burn the Circle 5 ranch to the ground. The violence in him, the thing he had spent 10 years suppressing in these mountains, roared to life. But he looked at Alara. She was trembling, not from cold, but from the exposure of her shame. If he showed his rage now, if he shouted or threw something, he would just be another man with a temper. He would be another source of fear. He forced his hands to uncurl. He took a slow, deep breath, mastering the wolf inside him. "He is a liar," Elias said. His voice was not loud, but it was hard as granite. It cut through the sound of the wind. Alara flinched. He is a liar," Elias repeated, leaning closer. He stood up and crossed the small distance between them. He did not touch her, but he knelt on one knee so that he was lower than her, looking up into her face. "He told you that you were a thing," Elias said, his voice fierce and low. "He told you that you were broken because he could not break you the way he wanted. Don't you see that, Alara? You are not dirty. You are not ruined. You survived a devil. That makes you iron. That makes you gold." Alara shook her head, a single tear finally escaping. "I feel dirty. I feel like his marks are still on me." "They are fading," Elias vowed. "Every day, they fade, and I will stand between you and him until the memory is gone. The blame is not yours, Alara, not 1 ounce of it." He stayed there, kneeling, until she nodded. It was a small, jerky nod, but it was enough. Elias sat back on his heels. He looked at the fire, the shadows playing across his scarred face. He felt the weight of her confession, and he knew he could not leave her alone in that vulnerability. He had to offer something of equal weight. "I am not a saint, Alara," he said quietly. You hear the stories in town. They call me a savage. They say I am dangerous. Elara wiped her cheek. I do not listen to them. You should, Elias said grimly. Some of it is true. He turned his hands over, looking at his palms. 12 years ago. I worked the herds in Wyoming. I was young. I had a temper like a powder keg. There was a man, a foreman. He liked to use a whip on the horses. One day, he used it on a boy who worked the stables. A boy who was slow in the head but gentle. Elias looked at Elara, his eyes dark with the memory. I did not think. I just moved. I pulled him off his horse. We fought. I hit him. Elara, I hit him until he stopped moving. And when I stood up, he was dead. Elara stared at him. She saw the size of his shoulders, the power in his arms. She should have been terrified. A killer. She was trapped in a cabin with a killer. But she looked at his eyes. They were filled with a haunted, ancient guilt. It was an accident. She asked. It was anger. Elias corrected. Unchecked anger. The law called it manslaughter. I served my time, but when I came out, the world looked different. I could not stand the towns. I could not stand the way men looked at each other, always measuring, always ready to strike. He looked toward the window, where the snow pressed against the glass. I went into the high country. I lived with the Ute people for 3 years. They did not care about my past. They taught me how to listen to the land. They taught me that a man is defined by his actions today, not yesterday. But the town, Granite Creek, they only see the blood on my hands. They see a man who turned his back on their church and their rules. He looked back at her. So you see, Elara, we are a pair, the ruined woman and the savage man. Elara looked at him for a long time. She saw the shame he carried, distinct from hers but just as heavy. He believed he was unfit for society. He believed he was a monster who had to hide in the mountains to keep others safe from him. But she remembered how he had held her elbow when she stumbled. She remembered how he had looked at her hands and called them gentle. You are not a savage, she said softly. Elias let out a short, dry breath. I'm close enough? No, she insisted. You saved me. A savage would have left me there. The admission hung in the air. By sharing his darkest truth, he had not frightened her away. He had drawn her closer. They were two outcasts, huddled against the cold. Finding that their jagged edges fit together, the blizzard worsened 2 nights later. The temperature dropped so low that the water in the bucket inside the cabin froze solid within an hour of being drawn. The wind found every microscopic gap in the chinking, sending icy drafts slicing through the room like knives. The fire was burning high, but it wasn't enough. The cabin was bleeding heat faster than the stove could generate it. Elias piled the last of the evening logs into the stove and latched the door. He could see his breath in the air, thick white clouds puffing with every exhalation. He looked over at the bed where Elara lay. She was buried under 3 heavy quilts and a buffalo robe, but the pile of bedding was vibrating. She was shaking so violently that the wood of the bed frame chattered against the wall. Elias walked over to the bed. Elara? Her face was pale, waxy in the dim light. Her lips had a blue tint to them. Her eyes were squeezed shut, her teeth clicking together uncontrollably. The cold had settled into her core. Elias cursed softly. This was dangerous. If she did not get warm soon, her heart would stop. The fire was not enough. Elara, he said, his voice urgent. She opened her eyes. They were glassy and unfocused. Cold, she stammered. So cold. Elias made a decision. He knew the boundaries he had set. He knew the promise he had made. But survival had its own laws. Move over, he said. Elara stared at him, confusion clouding her gaze. What? Move over, Elias repeated, stripping off his heavy boots and his outer vest. You are freezing. The blankets are not enough. You need body heat. Fear flared in her eyes, the old, instinctive fear of a man coming into her bed. She shrank back against the logs. No, she whispered. Elias paused. He held his hands up, showing her they were empty. Elara, look at me. It is Elias. I am not him. I am not going to hurt you. I am not going to touch you any more than I have to, but if I leave you alone, you will not wake up in the morning." He waited, letting her process the threat of the cold versus the threat of the man. "Please," he said gently, "just for warmth. I promise." Alara looked at his face. It was serious, worried, and entirely devoid of lust. She was so cold that her bones felt like ice. She nodded, a tiny movement. Elias blew out the lantern. The room plunged into darkness, save for the red glow from the stove vents. He climbed into the bed, keeping to the very edge. He lay down on top of the bottom sheet, but under the mountain of furs. The heat radiating from him was shocking. He was like a furnace. Elias lay rigid on his back, his arms crossed over his chest, staring at the ceiling. He kept a distinct 6 inches of space between them. He was acutely aware of her presence, of the scent of lavender soap and fear that clung to her. Alara lay curled in a tight ball on her side, facing him. She felt the warmth rolling off him in waves, battling the chill that had gripped her. Minutes passed. The shivering did not stop. Elias sighed in the dark. "It is not working," he said gruffly. "The air gap is too cold." He hesitated, then spoke into the darkness. "You need to come closer." Alara's breath hitched. She knew he was right. The cold was a physical pain in her chest. She had to choose. Slowly, agonizingly, she inched backward. She moved until her back brushed against his side. The contact was electric. She flinched, her muscles locking up, waiting for the grab, the grope, the violence. Elias did not move. He lay like a stone statue. He did not uncross his arms. He simply let her borrow his heat. Slowly, the warmth began to seep into her. It thawed the ice in her blood. Her shivering began to subside, turning from violent spasms to intermittent tremors. She relaxed, just a fraction. She could feel the slow, steady rise and fall of his chest against her back. It was a rhythmic, soothing motion. He was breathing deeply, calmly. He was nothing like Silas. Silas had been twitchy, restless, his body always coiled like a spring. Elias was a mountain, solid, immovable. Alara shifted, seeking more of that life-saving heat. She pressed her shoulders firmly against his arm. She felt the heavy wool of his shirt against her cheek. Elias remained still, but his voice came out of the dark, rough and low. "Is this all right?" "Yes," she whispered. "I can move to the floor if you are warm enough now," he offered. The thought of him leaving, of the cold rushing back into the space between them, was suddenly terrifying. It wasn't just the physical cold. It was the aloneness, lying here, against his solid back. She felt a safety she had not known existed. "Stay," she rasped. The word was barely a sound. Elias exhaled, a long breath. All right. They lay there in the silence of the blizzard. There were no kisses. His hands never strayed from his own chest, but the intimacy of it was dizzying. Alara lay with a man who could crush her, yet he held himself in check to keep her safe. She was choosing this. She was allowing this, for the first time in her life. She felt the power of her own consent. As sleep finally began to pull at her, she uncurled her hand. Her fingers drifted across the space between them and lightly grasped the fabric of his shirt near his ribs. An anchor. Elias felt the small, tentative grip of her fingers. He closed his eyes in the dark, his heart hammering a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. He did not move. He guarded her sleep through the long, frozen night. The blizzard broke 2 days later, leaving the valley buried under 4 feet of pristine, glittering white. The sun came out, blindingly bright, turning the world into a landscape of diamonds. The dynamic in the cabin had shifted permanently. The invisible wall that had stood between the bed and the pallet was gone. Elias moved back to his sleeping roll the next night, but the distance felt different now. It was respectful, not fearful. The touches began to happen. They were small things, woven into the fabric of their survival. When Elias came in from checking the traps, his hands red and stiff with cold, Alara took them in hers without thinking. She rubbed them briskly to restore the circulation, her thumbs working the muscles of his palms. Elias stood still, watching the top of her head, his breathing quiet and shallow. When they went outside to clear the snow from the roof, a necessary chore to prevent collapse, Alara slipped on a patch of hidden ice near the woodpile. Elias's hand shot out, catching her by the waist. He held her there for a moment, his gloved hand large and firm against the curve of her hip. She looked up at him, breathless, her cheeks flushed with exertion and cold. The sun caught the gray in his beard and the moss green of his eyes. "You have to watch your step," he said, his voice gruff. "I know," she said. "I knew you would catch me." The words hung in the crisp air. Elias looked at her, searching her face. He slowly released her waist, his fingers trailing away reluctantly. News from the world below arrived a week later. The snow had packed down enough for travel, and a rider appeared at the mouth of the valley. It was old Jed, a mule skinner who ran supplies to the mining camps. He rode a shaggy mare and led a pack horse. Elias met him at the cabin door, rifle in the crook of his arm. Alara stood behind him in the doorway. Jed touched his hat. "Mornin', Elias. Mrs. Mornin', Jed." Elias said, "You are the first face we have seen in 2 months. Brought you some mail," Jed said, digging into his saddlebag. "And a warning, if you will take it." He handed Elias a folded, sealed envelope. The paper was expensive, heavy cream stock. Alara recognized the handwriting immediately. It was sharp, angular, and aggressive. "Silas." Jed shifted in his saddle. "Talk in town is getting ugly. Elias, that husband of hers, ex-husband, I reckon, he is stirring the pot, telling folks you stole her, telling folks she was dragged off kicking and screaming. He has got the new judge listening to him. Says the marriage ain't valid because she was under duress." Elias looked at the letter in his hand. His face was a mask of stone. "And the gossip?" Elias asked. Jed spat into the snow. "Ugly. They say she is living in sin. They say she is a fallen woman now, sharing a bed with a wild man." Alara felt the blood drain from her face. She leaned against the doorframe. The shame, which she had thought buried under the snow, clawed its way back up. The town was judging her. Silas was coming for her. Jed tipped his hat again. "Just thought you should know. That man Vance, he is poisoning the well. Best watch your back." Jed turned his horse and began the slow trek back down the valley. Elias stood on the porch, staring at the letter. He did not open it. He turned and looked at Alara. He saw the terror in her eyes, the way her shoulders had hunched forward again, making herself small. He stepped toward her. He did not hesitate this time. He put his heavy hand on her shoulder, his grip firm and grounding. "Let them talk," Elias said. "They are wind, nothing more. But the law," Alara whispered. "If he brings the judge, then I will speak to the judge," Elias said. "You are my wife, Alara. By law and by choice, I made a vow to keep you from harm. A piece of paper from Silas Vance does not change that." He held the letter up. "Do you want to read it?" Alara looked at the envelope. She could imagine the words inside, the threats, the insults, the commands. "No," she said, her voice shaking but gaining strength from the weight of his hand on her shoulder. "Burn it," Elias nodded. He walked to the stove, opened the door, and tossed the unopened letter into the flames. They watched it curl, blacken, and disappear up the chimney. But the threat remained. It was a shadow at the edge of their bright, snowy world. The pressure of the outside world, ironically, forced the heat between them to rise. Every glance they shared now carried a weight of defiance. Every time they sat together in the evening, there was the silent acknowledgement that they were under siege. It made the air in the cabin thick with an unspoken, desperate energy. 3 nights after the letter, Alara was folding the clean laundry that had been drying on a rack near the stove. She was struggling to fold a large wool blanket, her arms not quite wide enough to span it. "Let me," Elias said. He stepped up behind her. He reached around her, his arms encompassing hers, to grab the corners of the blanket. For a moment, he did not pull the blanket away. He stood there, his chest pressed against her back, his arms caging her in, not to trap her, but to help her. Alara froze. She could feel the heat of him through her dress. She could smell the scent of him. Pine, smoke, and man. The memory of the cold night in the bed rushed back to her. But this time, there was no cold to fight. There was only heat. She turned in the circle of his arms. Elias looked down at her. He had not stepped back. His hands were still holding the blanket, but his eyes were locked on hers. They were dark, dilated, burning with a hunger he had kept chained for months. He dropped the blanket. It fell to the floor in a soft heap. He did not move to touch her, but he did not move away. The air between them crackled. Elara looked at his mouth. She saw the way his breathing had quickened. She felt a pull in her own belly, a sharp, sudden ache of desire that shocked her. She wanted him to kiss her. She wanted him to close the inch of space between them and crush the fear out of her. She swayed toward him, lifting her chin. Elias's head dipped, just a fraction. His hand twitched at his side, as if he were about to reach for her waist. Then the image of her bruised face, the way she had looked on the wagon 6 months ago, flashed through her mind. The memory of being used, the fear that if she gave into this, she would lose herself again. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced the desire. She gasped and stepped back, her hand flying to her mouth. I can't. The moment shattered. Elias froze. The hunger in his eyes vanished, replaced instantly by the mask of the protector. He stepped back, giving her 3 feet of space. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice rough. "I did not mean to. I forgot myself." "No," Elara said, breathless. "No, Elias, it isn't you. It is just—" "I am not ready. I want to be, but I am not." Elias nodded slowly. He looked at her with a profound sadness, but also with a limitless patience. "I know," he said. "I can wait. Elara, I have nowhere else to be." He bent down, picked up the fallen blanket, and folded it with deliberate, steady movements, while Elara stood by the stove, her heart racing, wondering how long they could both survive the fire that was starting to burn the cabin down from the inside. The fall spring arrived in late February. The sun turned blindingly bright, melting the surface of the snow into a treacherous slush during the day that froze into sheets of black ice at night. The valley echoed with the sound of dripping water, a constant, rhythmic ticking that marked the passage of time. It was during one of these bright, deceitful afternoons that the silence of the valley was broken. Elias was outside, splitting logs with a rhythmic, violent grace. Elara was by the window, kneading dough for biscuits, watching the play of muscles in his back. The domestic peace was shattered by the sharp report of a rifle shot, not a warning, but a signal. Elias dropped the axe and had his Winchester in his hands before the echo died away. He moved to the porch, his body blocking the doorway. "Stay inside," he commanded, his voice low and tight. Elara wiped the flour from her hands and moved to the window. Through the distortion of the glass, she saw 2 riders struggling up the slush-covered track. The lead horse was a bay gelding she recognized. It belonged to Sheriff Brody. Behind him rode a deputy she did not know, a young man with a nervous set to his shoulders. "They are not here to kill us." "Elias," Elara said, stepping out onto the porch despite his order. If they were, they would not be riding in the open. Elias did not lower the rifle. "They are bringing nothing good. Elara, the law does not climb this high for a social call." Sheriff Brody pulled his heaving horse to a halt 10 yards from the cabin. He looked uncomfortable, his eyes shifting from the rifle in Elias's hands to the bruised determination on Elara's face. He touched the brim of his hat, but the gesture lacked its usual courtesy. "Afternoon. Kincaid, Mrs. Vance." He said, "My name is Kincaid." Elara said. Her voice was thin in the cold air, but the correction was sharp. Brody sighed, reaching into his saddlebag. "That is the matter at hand. Ma'am, I have a paper here, a summons." He held out a folded document. Elias did not move to take it. "State your business." "Brody," Elias growled. "Or turn that horse around." Brody cleared his throat. "Silas Vance has filed a petition with the circuit judge. He claims that the marriage performed by Reverend Hayes was invalid. He claims Mrs. Vance, Elara, was mentally unfit at the time, that she was suffering from hysteria and was abducted by you, Kincaid. He claims you took advantage of a woman out of her mind to steal her dowry and her person." The words hung in the air. "Absurd and poisonous." "Abducted," Elias repeated. The words sounded like gravel grinding together. "She walked to me. The whole town saw it. That ain't how Silas tells it. Brody said, he says she was coerced. He has an order here for her to return to town for a hearing. Tomorrow at noon. If she does not appear, I am authorized to bring her in as a ward of the state." Elias racked the lever of the Winchester. The metallic clack-clack was deafening in the quiet valley. "She is not going anywhere," Elias said. "If Vance wants her, let him come up here and try to take her." Brody's hand drifted toward his pistol, his face hardening. "Don't do this. Elias, I don't want to shoot you, but I got a deputy here and more men down the mountain. This is the law. I will go," Elara said. Both men turned to look at her. Elias looked stricken, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Elara! No, I will not be a fugitive." "Elias," she said, her voice trembling but gaining strength. "If we hide up here, we prove him right. If we shoot at the law, we prove him right. He wants the world to think I am crazy and you are a savage. I will not give him that satisfaction." She stepped off the porch, the slush soaking the hem of her dress immediately. She walked to the sheriff's horse and took the paper from his hand. She did not look at the words. She looked Brody in the eye. "I will come down. I will speak for myself." Brody nodded, looking relieved. "Noon tomorrow, ma'am, at the town hall." As the lawmen turned their horses and began the treacherous descent, Elias turned on her. He gripped her shoulders, his fingers digging into the wool of her dress. "Do you know what you are doing?" he demanded, his voice cracking with fear. "He will twist everything. He owns that town. He owns the judge. You are walking into a trap." "I know," Elara whispered. She reached up and covered his hands with hers. "But I am not the same woman who left that town, Elias, and I am not going alone." Elias stared at her, his chest heaving. The rage was there, burning hot, but beneath it was a terrified awe. He nodded slowly. "No," he said, "you are not going alone." The journey down the mountain the next morning was a nightmare of mud and tension. The wagon skidded on the icy patches, the mules struggling for purchase. Elias drove with a grim, singular focus, his eyes scanning the tree line as if expecting an ambush. They barely spoke. The physical danger of the trail mirrored the precipice they were approaching emotionally. One slip of the wheel, and they would go over the edge. One wrong word in that courtroom, and their life together would end. As the town of Granite Creek came into view, gray and huddled under the bright sun, Elara felt a wave of nausea. This was the place where she had been shamed. This was the place that had watched her bleed and done nothing. Elias reached over and took her hand. His grip was crushing, desperate. "I will not leave your side," he promised, "not for a second. If they try to separate us, I will tear the building down." Elara squeezed back. "I know." The hearing was held in the town hall, a long, narrow building that served as a schoolhouse on weekdays and a court when the circuit judge rode through. It was packed. The stove in the corner was banked high, making the room stiflingly hot and smelling of damp wool, unwashed bodies, and tobacco smoke. Silas Vance sat at a table near the front. He was dressed in a dark suit, his hair slicked back, looking every inch the aggrieved, respectable pillar of the community. When Elara walked in, holding Elias's arm, Silas did not sneer. He looked at her with a performance of deep, pained concern. Judge Harrow was a thin, severe man with spectacles that magnified his watery eyes. He looked at Elias, buckskins, knife at his belt, looming large, and then at Silas. The bias was evident before a word was spoken. This hearing is to determine the competency of Elara Miller, formerly Vance, and the validity of her union with Elias Kincaid. The judge announced, "Mr. Vance, you may speak." Silas stood up. He spoke smoothly, his voice modulated to project a weary sadness. "Your Honor," he began, "it breaks my heart to drag private matters into the light, but my wife, Elara, has always been fragile, a nervous disposition." He turned to the crowd, catching the eyes of the shopkeepers and farmers. I tried to care for her. I gave her a good home. But she became hysterical. She would weep for days. She would injure herself, throw herself against doors, fall downstairs. When I tried to restrain her for her own safety, she would claim I was attacking her. A murmur went through the room. Alara felt the blood drain from her face. He was twisting the truth so skillfully that even she felt a flicker of doubt. Did I fall? Was I crazy? When I returned her to her father, Silas continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. It was an act of desperation. I hoped her family could help her. Instead, this man, this opportunistic drifter, stepped in. He saw a woman out of her mind with grief and confusion, and he took her. He abducted her to a cabin where no civilized woman could survive. I only want to bring her home to a sanitarium where she can get the help she needs. He sat down, wiping a non-existent tear from his eye. The townspeople nodded. It made sense. A wealthy rancher, a hysterical wife, a savage mountain man. It fit the stories they knew. Mrs. Vance, the judge said, looking at Alara with pitying condescension. Do you have anything to say? Alara stood up. Her legs felt like water. She gripped the back of the chair to steady herself. She felt Elias standing just behind her, a wall of heat and support. She looked at the judge. Then she looked at the crowd. Finally, she looked at Silas. He is lying, she said. Her voice shook, but it did not break. He did not care for me. He owned me. She took a breath, the air hot and stale in her lungs. He says I injured myself, but he knows exactly how I got these scars. He knows because he put them there. She pointed to her cheek, where a faint yellow shadow still lingered. He hit me because the coffee was cold. He threw me down the stairs because I answered him back. He locked me in the cellar for 2 days because I dropped a plate. He told me I was his property, like a cow or a horse. He told me that if I did not give him a son, I was broken goods. The room went silent. The explicit detail, spoken without hysteria, cut through Silas's narrative. He returned me, Alara said, her voice gaining strength. Not because I was crazy, but because he was done playing with me. He stood in the street and called me damaged. He tried to trade me for $500. She turned to Elias. This man did not abduct me. He asked me. He gave me a choice when everyone else, including my own father, was selling me. He took me in when I was bleeding. He has never raised his voice to me. He has never raised a hand. He is the only man I have ever known who treats me like a human being. Silas jumped up, his face reddening. She is lying. Look at her. She is clearly under his spell. He has threatened her. Sit down. Mr. Vance, the judge barked. Mr. Kincaid, what do you have to say? Elias stepped forward. He did not look at the judge. He looked at the crowd. He looked at the men who had stood on the boardwalk and watched a woman be humiliated. I am not a man of words, Elias said. His voice was a low rumble, vibrating through the floorboards. I saw a woman standing in the mud, shivering like a beaten dog. I saw a husband who looked at her with hate. I saw a father who looked at her with shame. He turned his gaze to Silas, and for a moment, the predator in him surfaced. Silas took a step back. You call her damaged, Elias said. You call her broken, but I have lived with her through the winter. I have seen her haul water through snowdrifts. I have seen her mend clothes by firelight. I have seen her wake up screaming from nightmares of you, and then get up and face the day. Elias's voice cracked. Just once, a fissure of raw emotion in the granite. She is not broken. She is the strongest thing I have ever known. I did not take her to steal from you. Vance, I took her because she deserved to be seen. He looked at Alara, and the rest of the room faded away. I told you she was perfect to me, Elias said softly. I meant it. I love her. Not as a possession, but as herself. The confession hit the room like a physical blow. Mountain men did not speak of love. They spoke of survival. The raw honesty of it shamed the men in the room who treated their own wives with indifference. Silas Vance snapped. The mask of the grieving husband shattered. Love? He sneered, his face twisting into the ugly mask Alara knew so well. You love a barren, frigid whore. She is useless. She is incapable of duty. She belongs in a cage, not a bed. I should have broken her neck when I had the chance. The silence that followed was absolute. Silas froze, realizing what he had said. He looked around. Reverend Hayes was staring at him with open horror. Sheriff Brody had straightened up, his hand resting on his gun belt, his eyes narrowed. The judge took off his spectacles and polished them slowly. "Mr. Vance," the judge said, his voice icy. That was an illuminating outburst. Silas stammered, trying to backtrack. I was provoked. I am distraught. Sit down," the judge ordered. The judge looked at the papers in front of him. He looked at Alara, small but standing tall. He looked at Elias, whose hands were clenched into fists at his sides. "This court finds the testimony regarding abduction to be unconvincing," the judge ruled. "However, the charges of mental incompetence are serious, and the validity of a marriage performed under such chaotic circumstances is questionable." He shuffled the papers. "I am not granting the order to return Mrs. Vance to the plaintiff." Alara let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. "But," the judge continued, "I am not dismissing the case. I am placing this matter under review. Sheriff Brody will investigate the claims of abuse. Until such time as a determination is made, the status of the marriage remains provisional. It was not a victory. It was a stay of execution. Court is adjourned," the judge said, banging his gavel. The room erupted into noise. Silas Vance stormed out, shoving people aside, his eyes locking on Alara with a promise of future violence as he passed. "You will pay for this," he hissed. "Both of you." Elias stepped in front of Alara, blocking Silas's view. Silas spat on the floor and exited. Outside, the air was cold and fresh after the stifling heat of the courtroom. Alara walked around the corner of the building, into the shadows of the alleyway, and her legs simply gave out. She sank down onto a crate, burying her face in her hands. The adrenaline crashed, leaving her shaking uncontrollably. She felt stripped raw. She had opened her chest and shown the town her heart, and they had only given her a provisional right to exist. Elias was there instantly. He knelt in the slush, not caring about the mud soaking his knees. "Alara," he murmured. "Alara, look at me." She looked up. Her eyes were swimming with tears. It wasn't enough. She choked out, "He is still coming. He will never stop." "We stopped him today," Elias said fiercely. "You stopped him. You stood there and you spoke the truth. I have never seen anything braver. I am so proud of you." He reached out and cupped her face in his rough, calloused hands. His thumbs brushed away the tears. "Proud," he repeated. Alara looked at him. She saw the man who had sat in the cold to keep her warm, the man who had just told a room full of people that he loved her. Something inside her snapped. Not a break, but a release. The dam that had held back her emotions, her needs, her own desire, crumbled. She did not wait. She did not ask. She reached out, grabbing the lapels of his coat, and pulled him to her. Elias made a surprised sound as her mouth crashed against his. It was not a gentle kiss. It was desperate. It tasted of salt and fear and the fierce, overwhelming need to be alive. It was a claim, for a heartbeat. Elias was rigid with shock. Then, with a low groan that came from the bottom of his soul, he surrendered. His arms went around her, crushing her against him. He kissed her back with a hunger that he had denied for months. A starving man finally given bread. They clung to each other in the shadowed alley. Indifferent to the town, indifferent to the law, when they finally broke apart. Both of them were breathless, their foreheads resting against each other. "Alara," Elias whispered, his voice wrecked. "Take me somewhere," she said. Her voice was steady now, fierce. "Not the mountains. Not yet. Somewhere with a door I can lock." Elias looked at her, searching her eyes for any sign of hesitation. He found only fire. "Come," he said. He took her to the boarding house at the edge of town. It was a simple place, clean and quiet. He paid for a room, ignoring the knowing look of the clerk. The room was small, dominated by a large iron bed and a washstand. The window looked out over the snowy rooftops. Elias locked the door. He slid the heavy bolt home. He turned to face her. The room felt charged. the air thick with the unspoken. Ilara stood by the bed. She felt exposed. Yet for the first time, she did not feel unsafe. She was terrified, yes, but not of him. She was terrified of the unknown, of the magnitude of what she was feeling. Elias stayed by the door. He took off his coat and hung it on a peg. He took off his gun belt and coiled it on the dresser. He seemed to be deliberately slowing down, giving her time. "You do not have to do this, Ilara," he said, his back to her. "Gratitude is not— I do not want gratitude." Ilara unbuttoned her cuffs. She walked over to him and placed a hand on his arm. Turning him around, "Do you think this is gratitude?" she asked. She took his hand and placed it flat against her chest, over her heart. It was beating wildly, a frantic bird against her ribs. "My husband told me I was dead inside," she said. "He told me I was cold." She stepped closer until her body brushed his. "Show me he was wrong. Elias, make me feel alive." Elias made a sound that was half prayer, half curse. He lifted her up, his hands spanning her waist, and carried her to the bed. He did not rush. He treated her as if she were made of glass, not because she was weak, but because she was precious. He undressed her with trembling hands, pausing every time he revealed a scar, kissing the old marks of violence as if his lips could erase them. "Is this all right?" he murmured against her skin. "Yes," she breathed. "Does this hurt?" "No." He let her set the pace. He let her guide his hands. He gave her the power that had been stolen from her. And in doing so, he showed her that her body was not a vessel for someone else's use. It was hers. And she could choose to share it. When they finally joined, it was not the brutal conquering she had known. It was a conversation. It was a slow, deep rhythm of giving and taking. Ilara cried. She couldn't help it. The tears leaked from her eyes, hot and fast. Elias stopped immediately, bracing his weight on his elbows. "Ilara!" "Stop! I'll stop!" "No!" she gasped, wrapping her legs around him, pulling him back down. "Don't stop! Please! It's just—" She couldn't explain that she was crying because he was heavy on her, yet she didn't feel crushed. She was crying because, for the first time, the act of love didn't feel like something being taken away from her, but something being given. "I am here," Elias whispered against her neck. "I have you." The climax, when it came, was a shock. It was a wave of heat that started in her belly and shattered her, leaving her gasping and clinging to his shoulders. Afterward, the room was quiet. The sun had set, and the blue twilight filled the window. They lay tangled together under the quilt. Elias's arm was heavy across her waist. Ilara rested her head on his shoulder, her fingers tracing the scars on his chest, the marks of his own battles. She felt changed. The girl who had ridden in the wagon, shaking and bruised, was gone. In her place was a woman who knew the weight of a man's love and the strength of her own desire. Elias kissed the top of her head. "We have to go back tomorrow," he said quietly. "Silas will not stop. He will hire men. He will come for us outside the law now." "I know," Ilara said. She lifted her head and looked at him. Her eyes were clear, the fear replaced by a steely resolve. "Let him come. We are not just surviving anymore. Elias, we are living." "And I will fight for this life." Elias pulled her tighter, his face buried in her hair. "We will fight," he promised, "and we will win." But as the wind picked up outside, rattling the window pane, they both knew that the hardest battle was yet to come. The law had failed to protect them. Now, only the mountains and their own will stood between them and the storm Silas Vance was about to unleash. The return to the High Valley was a pilgrimage, not of penance, but of reclamation. The wagon rattled over the frozen ruts of the trail, the mules puffing white clouds of breath into the thin air. But the silence that stretched between Elias and Ilara was no longer a chasm. It was a comfortable, living thing, filled with the memory of the room in the boarding house and the promise of the nights to come. When the cabin finally came into view, nestled against the granite spine of the mountain like a stubborn barnacle, Ilara did not feel the oppressive weight of isolation she had felt months ago. She felt a fierce, possessive swell in her chest. This rough-hewn structure, with its smoking chimney and thick, defensive walls, was her sanctuary. It was the only place on earth where she was not defined by her father's debts or her husband's fists. They settled into a new rhythm, one that was dangerously tender. The harshness of the mountain winter remained. The wind still screamed through the canyons, and the snow still drifted against the door, but the atmosphere inside the cabin had thawed completely. Mornings began not with the sharp, lonely crack of wood being split in the dark, but with the warmth of skin against skin beneath the heavy buffalo robes. Elias, a man who had lived in silence for a decade, seemed to have discovered a new language in touch. He would linger before rising, his rough fingers tracing the line of Alara's spine or brushing the hair from her face as the gray dawn light filtered through the frosted glass. There were small, quiet intimacies that wove themselves into the day's labor. When Alara washed the dishes in the basin, Elias would pause on his way out the door, his hand resting on the small of her back for a moment longer than necessary, a silent anchor. When they passed the heavy iron skillet between them, their fingers would brush, and the look they exchanged was heavy with a dark, simmering heat. Laughter, once a foreign sound in the valley, began to echo off the log walls. It was quiet laughter, born of small things. Elias trying to explain the stubborn personality of a particular mule, or Alara recounting the absurd hat misses Gable had worn in church, but it was real. It was the sound of two people learning that happiness was not a finite resource that had run out for them, but the world below would not let them be. 2 weeks after their return, a trader named Solomon arrived. He was a gnarled, cynical man who traded in pelts, whiskey, and information, moving between the mining camps and the trapping lines on a shaggy pony that looked as mean as he did. Elias met him on the porch, not inviting him inside. Alara watched from the window, wiping her hands on her apron. She saw the serious set of Elias's shoulders and the way Solomon kept glancing toward the trees, as if expecting to be followed. When Elias came back inside, his face was a mask of grim calculation. "What is it?" Alara asked, her heart tripping a beat. Elias walked to the hearth and stirred the fire, sending sparks rushing up the chimney. "Solomon came from the lower pass. He says Silas has been busy." "Busy? How? He is drinking heavily," Elias said, his voice low. "And he is talking loudly. He has hired men, not local boys. Drifters, rough riders from down near the border, men who do not care about the law. Only the coin." Alara felt the cold seep into the room, bypassing the fire. "What does he want?" "He wants what he considers his property," Elias said, turning to look at her. "Solomon says Silas has put a bounty of sorts out. He told the men to bring you back, or at least to make sure that if he cannot have you, no one else does. He spoke of making an example of us. The threat was clear. Silas Vance was done with courts and judges. He was reverting to the only language he truly spoke: violence." Alara waited for the fear to paralyze her, for the old instinct to hide to take over, but it did not come. Instead, she felt a cold, hard knot of anger tighten in her stomach. She looked at the cabin walls, at the bed where they slept, at the life they were stitching together. "Let him try," she whispered. Elias looked at her, surprised by the steel in her voice. Then he nodded, a slow, dangerous appreciation in his eyes. "We will be ready," he promised. The preparations began immediately. Elias was methodical. He reinforced the heavy oak bar on the door with iron brackets he forged in the small shed. He cut firing ports into the shutters, narrow slits that would allow a rifle barrel to pass through but offered little target for return fire. He stockpiled firewood inside the cabin, stacking it along the north wall until it acted as additional insulation and armor. But the most significant preparation was not structural. One afternoon, when the wind had died down to a manageable breeze, Elias took his Winchester rifle and a box of ammunition out to the clearing behind the cabin. He set up a row of pine cones on a fallen log, 50 yards away. "Come here, Alara," he called. She stepped off the porch, wrapping her shawl tight. She watched him check the lever action, the metal gleaming with oil. "You need to know this," Elias said. "I cannot be your only shield. If they come when I am checking the high line, you need to be able to stop them." He held the rifle out to her. It was heavy, the wood stock smooth and cold against her palm. She had held it before, but only to move it. She had never fired it. "Lift it," Elias instructed. "Into your shoulder. Tight. If you leave a gap, the kick will bruise you." Elara raised the weapon. It wavered. The barrel felt impossibly long and heavy. She tried to sight down the metal bead, but the pine cone was a blur. Elias stepped behind her. "Relax your knees," he murmured, his voice right at her ear. He moved in close, his chest pressing against her back. His heat enveloped her, a stark contrast to the biting air. He reached around her, his large hands covering hers on the stock and the barrel. "Like this," he said. He adjusted her grip, his fingers strong and sure. He guided her elbow up, creating a stable platform. He pulled her body back against his until they were moving as one entity. Elara's breath hitched. The proximity was overwhelming. She could feel the steady beat of his heart against her shoulder blades. She could smell the scent of gunpowder, pine resin, and the unique, masculine musk of him. It was a lesson in violence, but it felt intimately, confusingly erotic. "Breathe," Elias whispered, his lips grazing her temple. "Take a breath in. Let half of it out. Hold it, then squeeze. Do not pull. Squeeze." Elara inhaled. The air tasted of snow. She let the breath out. The front sight settled on the pine cone. She felt Elias's body tensing behind her, bracing her. She squeezed the trigger. The crack of the rifle was deafening, echoing off the canyon walls like a thunderclap. The stock kicked back into her shoulder. A sharp punch. But Elias absorbed the recoil with her. The pine cone exploded into a spray of wood chips. "I did it," Elara gasped, lowering the rifle, her ears ringing. "You did," Elias said. He did not step away. He stayed pressed against her, his hands still covering hers on the warm steel of the gun. "Again," he said, his voice rougher now. "Until you do not have to think about it." They spent the afternoon in the snow, surrounded by the smell of sulfur and the echo of shots. With every round she fired, the fear of the weapon diminished, replaced by a surging sense of power. She was not helpless. She held thunder in her hands. And with every correction Elias made, every time he guided her hips or adjusted her stance, the current of desire between them grew stronger, fed by the adrenaline and the shared purpose of survival. That evening, the cabin felt smaller, the air charged with the lingering energy of the afternoon. They sat by the stove, the metal ticking as it cooled. Elara was cleaning the soot from her hands with a rag. Elias was watching her. He had been watching her for an hour, his book forgotten on his knee. Elara looked up and met his gaze. The firelight cast deep shadows across his face, making him look wilder, more like the creature the town believed him to be. But she saw only the man who had stood behind her and taught her to bite back. "I used to think I was ruined," she said. The words came out without preamble, clear and steady. Elias went still. He did not interrupt. "When Silas sent me back, when the town looked at me, I believed them. I thought that because I had been beaten, because I had been touched in anger and used without love, that I was broken, that I was something spoiled." She stood up and walked over to him. She stood between his spread knees, looking down into his face. "But today, out there with the rifle, feeling you behind me, I realized something." She reached out and touched his cheek, her fingers rougher than they had been a month ago, calloused by work and cold. "I am not ruined, Elias. I am just scarred, and scars are just skin that is harder than it was before." Elias looked up at her, his eyes shining with a fierce, wet emotion. He reached up and covered her hand with his, pressing her palm against his jaw. "You were never ruined, Elara," he said, his voice thick. "You were hidden. You were a diamond covered in mud. I just helped wash it off." He pulled her down into his lap. There was no hesitation this time, no tentative testing of boundaries. The threat of Silas and his men hung over them like a blade, and it made every second precious. The kiss was not gentle. It was a collision. It was a defiance of every dark thing that waited in the woods. Elara kissed him with the hunger of a woman who had learned to shoot, who had learned to stand. Elias kissed her with the desperate devotion of a man who would burn the world down to keep her warm. They moved to the bed, the firelight painting their skin in gold and shadow. The wind howled outside, rattling the shutters, but it only served to underscore the heat inside. "Make me forget him," Elara whispered against his throat as his hands moved over her, claiming her, worshipping her. "I will make you forget your own name," Elias growled. And he did. That night, there was no fear, no ghosts of the past. There was only the friction of skin, the taste of salt, and the absolute, terrifying vulnerability of being fully known and fully wanted. They came together with a primitive urgency, a coupling that was half prayer and half war cry. When Elara cried out, it was not in pain, but in triumph. She was alive, she was whole, and she belonged to no one but herself and the man she chose to hold. 3 days later, the war came to the valley. The morning had dawned bright and deceivingly calm. Elias had left before sunrise to check the trap line in the upper gorge. A 3-hour trek. He had hesitated at the door, looking back at Elara where she slept, his hand on the latch. He had almost woken her to say goodbye, but she looked so peaceful he had let her be. Elara woke an hour later. She dressed quickly, the cabin cooling rapidly without the fire stoked. She set the coffee pot on the stove and went to the window to check the weather. The sun was blinding on the snow crust. The trees stood like black sentinels against the white. Then, movement. It was just a flicker at the edge of the tree line, a shadow that moved against the wind. Elara froze. A deer? An elk? Then she saw the glint of sun on metal. A rifle barrel. 2 riders emerged from the pines, followed by a third. They were not moving with the caution of travelers. They were spread out, moving tactically toward the cabin. They wore heavy dusters and hats pulled low. They were hard men, riding hard horses. Silas's men. Elara's heart slammed against her ribs. She was alone. Elias was miles away. Panic flared, bright and hot, threatening to buckle her knees. "Hide!" a voice screamed in her head. "Crawl under the bed! Hide!" She looked at the rifle leaning against the wall by the door. The Winchester Elias had taught her to use. "No," she thought. "I am not a rabbit. I am a wolf's wife." She moved. She did not run. She moved with purpose. She dropped the heavy iron bar across the door. Securing it, she moved to the windows, slamming the heavy wooden shutters closed and latching them. The cabin plunged into darkness. Save for the shafts of light coming through the firing ports, she grabbed the rifle. She checked the load, her hands shaking but her fingers remembering the motions. Lever down, cartridge in, lever up, hammer back. She went to the port on the north wall, peering through the slit. The riders were closer now, 50 yards out. They had stopped. One of them, a man with a red scarf wrapped around his face, shouted toward the cabin. "Open up. We know you are in there, girl." Elara pressed her cheek against the cold wood of the wall. She brought the rifle up. "Go away," she screamed. Her voice cracked, terrified, but loud. "You have no business here," the man laughed. It was an ugly, carrying sound. "We have business, darlin'. Mister. Vance wants his property back. You come out nice and quiet, and we won't have to burn you out." Elara's finger hovered over the trigger. Burn her out? They would kill her. Or worse, they would drag her back to Silas. "I said leave!" Elara yelled. "Have it your way!" the man shouted. He raised his rifle and fired. The bullet slammed into the door frame, sending a shower of splinters into the room. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space. Elara screamed, ducking instinctively. The smell of pine sap and dust filled her nose. They were shooting at her. They were actually shooting. Fear turned into a cold, focused survival instinct. She stood up. She shoved the barrel of the Winchester through the slit. She didn't try to pick a specific target. Her hands were shaking too badly. She aimed at the group of horses. She squeezed the trigger. Boom! The rifle kicked hard. Outside, a horse screamed and reared, throwing its rider into a snowdrift. "That's it, boys. Get her!" More shots rang out. Bullets thudded into the logs, thwacking into the heavy timber. One punched through a chink in the mortar and smashed a jar of dried beans on the shelf, sending shrapnel of ceramic across the floor. Elara racked the lever. She moved to the other window. She fired again. Boom! She was fighting. She was holding them back. High on the ridge, a mile away. Elias Kincaid froze. The sound of a gunshot in the mountains carried for miles. A distinct, flat crack that was unlike any natural sound. One shot, then a pause, then a volley. Elara. Elias dropped the beaver pelt he was holding. He did not bother to pack his gear. He grabbed his rifle and began to run. He did not run like a man. He ran like a mountain lion. He moved through the deep snow with long, loping strides, ignoring the burning in his lungs, ignoring the treacherous footing. He cut through the trees, abandoning the trail for a direct line down the sheer face of the ridge. The sounds of the siege grew louder. He heard the heavy thud of large-caliber rounds hitting wood. Rage, black and blinding, flooded his vision. If they touched her, if they hurt one hair on her head, he would skin them alive. He would leave their bodies for the crows. He reached the tree line above the cabin, chest heaving, sweat freezing on his brow. He dropped into a crouch, scanning the scene. 3 men. One was pulling himself out of a drift. 2 were taking cover behind the woodpile, his woodpile, firing at the shuttered windows. Elias didn't yell. He didn't warn them. He was past warnings. He brought his rifle up. He took a breath, steadying his hands despite the sprint. He aimed at the man firing near the corner of the cabin. He squeezed the trigger. The shot took the man in the shoulder. He spun around, dropping his rifle, screaming in shock and pain. Elias racked the lever and fired again, putting a bullet into the dirt inches from the second man's head, spraying him with frozen mud. The attackers panicked. They had expected a helpless woman, not a crossfire. It's the mountain man. He's flanking us. Elias moved. He didn't stay in one spot. He sprinted to a large boulder 10 yards to his left, racked the lever, and fired again. He wanted them to think they were surrounded. "Go!" the injured man screamed, clutching his shoulder. "Let's go!" They scrambled for their horses. They were mercenaries, bullies paid to intimidate a girl. They were not prepared to die for Silas Vance's pride. Elias fired one last shot, knocking the hat off the rider who was mounting up. "Run!" Elias roared, his voice echoing like a landslide. "Run and tell Vance I am coming for him!" The riders spurred their horses, kicking up frantic clouds of snow. They fled down the trail, disappearing into the trees in a chaotic retreat. Elias watched them go, his chest heaving, his fingers still tight on the trigger. He waited until the sound of their hoofbeats faded. Then he turned and ran to the cabin. "Elara!" He pounded on the door. "Elara! It is me! Open the door!" There was a long silence. Then the scrape of the heavy bar being lifted. The door swung open. Elara stood there, the rifle still clutched in her hands. Her face was smeared with soot and dust. Her hair was wild. Her eyes were wide, the pupils blown black with adrenaline. She looked at him. She looked at the blood on the snow where the man had fallen. "Elias?" she whispered. Elias dropped his rifle and crossed the threshold in one stride. He grabbed her, pulling her into him, crushing her against his chest. "I am here," he gasped, burying his face in her neck. "I am here. You are safe." Elara stood rigid for a moment, the shock holding her frozen. Then the rifle clattered to the floor, and she collapsed. She didn't faint, but her legs simply refused to hold her anymore. She slid down, clutching at his coat, sobbing. It was a jagged, ugly sound, the release of terror she had held at bay with gunpowder. Elias sank to the floor with her. He held her, rocking her back and forth. "You did it. You held them off. You were so brave. God, Elara, you were so brave." Elara trembled violently. "I shot at them," she stuttered. "I shot a man's horse. I might have killed them." "You protected our home," Elias said fiercely. "You did what you had to do." He pulled back to look at her, checking her frantically. "Are you hurt? Did they hit you?" "No," she shook her head. "Just scared." "I was so scared." She grabbed his lapels, pulling him back to her. "I thought I would never see you again," she sobbed. When they started shooting, all I could think was that I hadn't said goodbye. I didn't want to die without you knowing. Knowing what? Elias asked, wiping a smudge of soot from her cheek. That I love you, she choked out. That I wanted to live with you. Elias closed his eyes, resting his forehead against hers. I know. They sat on the floor of the battered cabin for a long time, surrounded by the smell of gun smoke and the splinters of their door. The wind blew through the bullet holes in the logs, a high, whistling sound. Finally, the adrenaline faded, leaving them exhausted and cold. Elias stood up and helped Alara to the bed. He went to the door, looking out at the trail, then closed and barred it again. He came back to her, sitting on the edge of the mattress. His face was grave. They will be back, he said quietly. Not these men, but Silas. He will not stop. He cannot accept defeat. Alara sat up, wrapping a quilt around her shoulders. She looked at the bullet hole in the wall opposite the window. It had missed her head by a foot. What do we do? She asked. Elias looked at his hands. We could leave. We could pack the wagon tonight, go north to Canada, or west to Oregon, disappear where he cannot find us. He looked at the cabin, at the shelves he had built, at the life they had made. It would mean running, starting over, living like fugitives. Alara looked at him. She saw the weariness in his eyes, the willingness to give up his home to keep her safe. She thought of the road. She thought of hiding. She thought of Silas Vance sitting in his ranch house, thinking he had won, thinking he had driven them out. No, she said. Elias looked up. No, I am done running. Elias, I ran from my father's house. I ran from Silas. I ran to the mountains. If we leave now, we run for the rest of our lives. She reached out and took his hand. Her grip was strong. This is my home. You are my husband. We built this. I will not let him take it. I will not let him drive us out like rats. Elias stared at her. He saw the transformation complete. The girl who had flinched at a raised hand was gone. In her place was a woman who had defended her castle. If we stay, Elias said, his voice low. It ends in blood. He will come himself next time. Let him come, Alara said. Her voice was cold, hard, and absolutely certain. We have the high ground. We have the winter, and we have each other. She looked at the rifle on the floor. Teach me how to shoot better, she said. Elias looked at her, and a slow, fierce pride spread across his face. He leaned forward and kissed her forehead. We stay, he agreed. And we fight. Outside. The wind picked up, howling through the pines, carrying the scent of snow and the promise of a final reckoning. The valley was no longer a hiding place. It was a fortress, and they were its defenders. The thaw arrived not as a gentle awakening, but as a violent rupture. The silence of the high winter was replaced by the roar of water. Snow that had lain heavy and white for months collapsed into gray slush, feeding the creeks until they swelled into brown, churning torrents that tore saplings from the banks. The air smelled of wet earth, rotting pine needles, and the sharp, green scent of new life pushing through the mud. For Elias and Alara, the spring brought freedom of movement, but it also dissolved the wall of snow that had protected them. The pass was open. The news came on the first day of April, carried by a prospector named Dutch who was heading up to the high loads. He sat on his mule outside their cabin, chewing on a piece of dried venison, his eyes darting nervously toward the trail behind him. He is coming, Dutch said, wiping his mouth with a dirty sleeve. Silas Vance. He has got 4 men with him this time. Real hard cases from the border. I saw them watering their horses at the lower ford. They are not carrying mining gear, Elias. They are carrying Winchesters and rope. Elias stood on the porch, his hand resting on the post he had reinforced during the long winter nights. He looked at Alara, who stood in the doorway. She did not tremble. She did not look for a place to hide. She simply wiped her hands on her apron and nodded. How long? Elias asked. With the mud, Dutch calculated, spitting into a puddle. By noon tomorrow, maybe sooner if he pushes those horses to death. Thank you, Dutch, Elias said. The prospector touched his hat. I did not see you. Understand. I want no part of this war." He kicked his mule and scrambled up the scree, disappearing into the timber. Elias turned to Alara. "We have a day." He walked into the cabin and began to gather his gear. He moved with a calm, methodical efficiency that Alara had come to love. There was no panic in him, only a focused, lethal intent. "We need to check the perimeter," Elias said. "I will go to the Narrows. You stay here and—" "No," Alara said. Elias stopped, a coil of rope in his hand. He looked at her. "I am not staying inside," Alara said. Her voice was quiet, but it had the tensile strength of the wire he used for snares. "When they came before, I hid in the dark. I shot through a hole in the wall. I felt like a rat in a cellar." She walked over to the rack where her rifle, the one he had taught her to use until she could hit a pine cone at 50 yards, rested. She picked it up, checking the action with a fluid. Practiced motion. "If he is coming to take me, he will see me standing," Alara stated. "I will not be behind you. Elias, I will be beside you." Elias looked at her for a long moment. He saw the change in her, the way the mountain winter had stripped away the soft, fearful parts of her spirit and left something tempered and resilient. He saw the woman who had kept him warm, who had learned to hunt, who had laughed with him in the dark. He nodded slowly. "Beside me." Then, they spent the afternoon turning the valley into a gauntlet. They did not dig pits or build walls. Elias knew that the land itself was the best weapon. They identified loose rock slides above the narrowest part of the trail and set triggers. Simple tension lines that, if cut or pulled, would bring tons of granite down on the path. They cleared firing lanes, trimming back branches that obscured the sight lines from the high ridge. They staged ammunition caches behind boulders. It was grim work, performed in the cold mud. But they worked in perfect tandem. They spoke little, their communication reduced to nods and hand signals. They were a pack of two, defending their den. That night, they ate a meal of salt pork and beans in silence. The cabin felt different. It was no longer a home. It was a fortress waiting for a siege. When they lay down in the narrow bed, Elias pulled her close. He did not speak of the future. He did not promise that everything would be fine. He simply held her, his hand pressed flat against the small of her back, anchoring her to the earth. "I love you," Alara whispered into the dark. Elias kissed her forehead. "Rest now. You will need your eyes sharp tomorrow." The morning dawned cold and bright. The sun glinted off the patches of remaining snow, blinding in its intensity. The air was still, broken only by the cry of a hawk circling the thermal currents. They heard the horses before they saw them. The sound of metal shoes striking rock echoed up the canyon walls. A harsh, unnatural clatter. Elias and Alara took their positions. They did not wait in the cabin. They stood on a flat shelf of rock 50 feet above the trail, protected by a natural parapet of boulders. It gave them the high ground and a clear view of the approach. Silas Vance rode in front. He looked older than Alara remembered. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken and feverish. He wore a long duster coat that flapped around his legs, and he rode a tall black stallion that foamed at the mouth, driven too hard. Behind him were 4 men who looked exactly as Dutch had described. Hard, unshaven, with eyes that assessed the valley not for its beauty, but for its kill zones. Silas pulled his horse to a halt in the clearing in front of the cabin. He looked at the empty porch, the barred door, the silent chimney. "Alara!" he shouted. His voice cracked, strained by anger and the thin air. "I know you are here. Come out!" Elias shifted his weight, settling the stock of his rifle against his shoulder. He looked at Alara. She nodded. "We are here. Silas!" Alara called out. She stepped out from behind the boulder, standing in full view on the ridge. She held her rifle across her chest, not aiming it, but ready. Elias stepped out beside her, his presence looming like a thunderhead. Silas's head snapped up. He stared at her, blinking against the sun. For a moment, he looked confused. The woman standing on the cliff, dressed in heavy wool trousers and a man's coat, her hair braided back, a weapon in her hands, bore no resemblance to the fragile, broken doll he had thrown away. "Come down here," Silas commanded. His voice dropped to a wheedling, poisonous tone. Come down. Ilara, I forgive you. You were confused. You were led astray by this animal. I have a wagon waiting. We can go home. No one needs to know about this shame. Ilara felt a ghost of the old nausea, the sick feeling of his manipulation, but it passed quickly, burned away by the clean mountain air. There is no home with you, she called back. Her voice rang off the canyon walls, clear and steady. And I need no forgiveness from you. You forfeited the right to speak to me the day you raised your fist. Silas's face twisted. The mask of the benevolent husband slipped. You are my wife, he roared. By God and the law. You belong to me. I belong to no one, Ilara shouted. I am not a chair. I am not a broodmare. I am a free woman, and I am married to a man who knows the value of a soul. Silas slammed his hand against his saddle horn. He turned to the men behind him. Go get her, he screamed. Drag her down. If the savage gets in the way, kill him. The riders hesitated. They looked up at the cliff. They saw the two rifles pointing down at them. They saw the narrow, treacherous path that led up to the ridge, exposed every inch of the way. That is a killing box. Mr. Vance, one of the riders muttered, spitting tobacco juice. We cannot ride up that. I am paying you to ride, Silas shrieked. Move! Elias spoke then. His voice was not a shout, but a deep rumble that carried immense weight. Take one step up that trail, he warned, and you will not step down. The snow is soft, but the rock is hard. Go home. This is not your fight. The lead rider, a scarred man with a gray mustache, looked at Elias. He looked at the terrain. He looked at Silas, who was trembling with impotent rage. He is right, the rider said. I didn't sign up for a suicide run. This ain't a retrieval, it is a slaughter. The rider wheeled his horse around. Where are you going? Silas demanded, reaching for his pistol. I am going to live, the rider said. He kicked his horse and started back down the trail. Another rider followed him. Then a third. Cowards, Silas screamed after them. I will ruin you. I will see you hanged. Only one man remained, a young, nervous gunman who looked unsure of what to do. He looked at Silas, then at the rifles above. He slowly holstered his gun and backed his horse away, shaking his head. Silas was alone. The silence that followed was heavy and terrible. Silas sat on his heaving horse, staring up at the couple. His chest was heaving. His eyes were wide and mad. He had lost his power. He had lost his audience. All that was left was his hate. You think you have won? Silas hissed. You think you can steal what is mine? He yanked his rifle from its scabbard. He didn't aim at Elias, he aimed at Ilara. I would rather see you dead than with him. Elias moved instantly, stepping in front of Ilara, but she was already moving. Silas fired. The bullet chipped the rock inches from Ilara's boot. Elias fired a warning shot, kicking up dirt in front of the stallion's hooves. Go, Silas! It is over. But Silas was beyond reason. He spurred his horse, not away, but forward. He charged the narrow footpath that led up the cliff face. It was madness. The horse scrabbled on the wet rock, terrified. Silas jumped from the saddle, abandoning the horse. He began to climb the rocks on foot, clawing his way up the shale, his rifle in one hand. He was panting, muttering curses, his eyes fixed on Ilara with a singular, murderous intent. He is trying to flank us on the goat trail, Elias said. They moved back, shifting their position to cover the ledge where Silas would emerge. Silas appeared over the rim of the ledge, 20 feet away. He looked wild, his suit torn, his face bleeding from a scratch. He raised his rifle. Ilara! He screamed. Ilara raised her own rifle. She had him in her sights. She could end it. Her finger tightened on the trigger, but she didn't fire. Silas took a step forward, bringing the rifle to his shoulder. His boot landed on a patch of scree, loose, flat stones that had been lubricated by the melting snow. His foot slipped. It happened in slow motion. Silas's eyes went wide. His arms flailed, the rifle flying from his grip. He grabbed for a handhold, but his fingers found only wet moss and crumbling shale. He fell backward. There was no scream, just a sharp intake of breath, the sound of fabric tearing on rock. and then the sickening, heavy thud of a body hitting the ravine floor 50 feet below. Then, silence. The wind whistled through the pines. The hawk cried out again, indifferent. Alara lowered her rifle. She walked to the edge of the cliff and looked down. Silas Vance lay twisted among the boulders in the creek bed. The water rushed around him, pulling at his long coat. He did not move. His neck was bent at an unnatural angle. Alara stared at him. She waited for the grief. She waited for the joy. She waited for the satisfaction of revenge. None of it came. There was only a hollow, ringing emptiness. The monster was dead, but he looked so small down there. Just a man, just a bundle of clothes and broken bones. The land took him, Elias said softly, coming to stand beside her. He did not look triumphant. He looked weary. Alara nodded. She felt a profound exhaustion settle into her bones, heavier than the rifle. He did it to himself, she whispered. He never watched where he was stepping. He only looked at what he wanted to take. They stood there for a long time, watching the water rush past the man who had tried to own the world. The last of the riders had vanished. The valley was theirs again. The sheriff arrived 2 days later. It was Brody, riding with the coroner and a small posse. They moved slowly, wary of the traps. But Elias met them at the trailhead and guided them in. They stood in the ravine, the men taking off their hats as the coroner examined the body. It was a somber scene. The violence had been washed away by the creek, leaving only the cold reality of death. Brody walked up the slope to where Alara and Elias stood. He looked at the defensive positions, the firing lines, the desperation etched into the landscape. Then he looked at Alara. He tried to kill you, Brody asked. It was not really a question. He tried. Alara said. She pointed to the chip in the rock where his bullet had struck. He fired first. He came up that ledge to finish it. He slipped. Brody looked down at the body. I spoke to the riders he hired. They didn't make it far. We picked them up in the foothills. They told us everything. Said Vance was out of his mind. Said he ordered them to kill Elias and drag you back by rope. The sheriff shook his head, spitting into the mud. I should have stopped him in town. Alara, I knew he was unhinged. I let his money do the talking for too long. It was an admission of guilt, rare for a man with a badge in a town built on gold and influence. Alara looked at him. You are here now. Sheriff, that is what matters. Brody nodded. He took a notebook from his pocket and scribbled something. Accidental death, he said firmly. Caused by misadventure while trespassing. Case closed. He looked at Elias. The marriage stands. Kincaid, legal and binding. She is your wife. And Mr. Vance, well, he has no more claims on anyone. It was an imperfect justice. It did not erase the bruises or the months of terror, but it was final. The law had finally aligned with the truth. They loaded the body onto a pack horse. It was a clumsy, undignified end for the cattle baron. As the procession wound its way down the valley, Alara watched them go. She felt a weight lifting from her chest, a physical lightness that made her dizzy. The whispers in town would continue. She knew. Some would say she pushed him. Some would say Elias shot him. But the venom had been drawn out of the wound. They were no longer fugitives. They were survivors. The spring deepened into early summer. The valley exploded with color. Wildflowers, blue columbine, Indian paintbrush, yellow arnica carpeted the meadows. The air turned sweet and warm. Alara and Elias worked the earth behind the cabin. It was hard labor, breaking the rocky soil, but they did it together. They planted potatoes, rows of hardy beans and onions. Alara insisted on a patch of flowers near the door, a useless, beautiful indulgence that Elias grumbled about but watered faithfully when she wasn't looking. The mountains, once a wall of white death, now felt like a cradle. The granite cliffs that had trapped the sound of gunshots now sheltered the garden from the wind. One evening in June, the sun was setting in a blaze of purple and gold. The door of the cabin stood open to the cool air. Alara sat in the rocking chair Elias had built for her, a rough but sturdy thing padded with a deer hide. She rested her hand on her abdomen. It was too soon to be sure, or maybe it wasn't. There was a difference in the way she felt, a settling. a strange fluttering sensation that wasn't hunger and wasn't fear. She had missed her time twice now. She looked at her hands. They were brown from the sun, calloused from the hoe, scarred from the cold. They were the hands of a woman who lived in the wild. She smiled. Elias came in from the shed. He smelled of sawdust and horses. He looked tired, his shirt stained with sweat. But when he saw her, his face softened. The harsh lines around his eyes, etched by years of squinting into the glare, smoothed out. He walked over to her and knelt beside the chair. He didn't speak. He just took her hand and pressed his face into her palm. "Elias," she said softly. He looked up. "Yeah, I think." She hesitated. She wanted to keep the secret a little longer, just for herself. But looking at him, she couldn't. "I think we are going to need more room for the garden next year," she said. Elias frowned, confused. "Why? We have plenty for two." Alara smiled, placing his hand on her stomach. "Not for two," she whispered. "For three." Elias froze. His hand was heavy and warm on her belly. He stared at her, his mouth opening slightly. The realization hit him, and she saw the tears well up in his green eyes, tears he would never shed in front of anyone else. "Are you sure?" he choked out. "I feel it," she said. "A new life." Elias buried his face in her lap. His shoulders shook. He held her as if she were the Holy Grail, the most precious thing in the universe. "Thank you," he murmured. "Thank you." Later that night, they lay in the narrow bed. The window was cracked open, letting in the sounds of the night, the chirping of crickets, the hoot of an owl, the rush of the creek. They lay tangled together, limbs heavy with sleep and contentment. Alara rested her head on his chest, listening to the steady, strong beat of his heart. "You know," Elias said into the darkness, his voice rough with sleep. "What? They called you damaged. They called you ruined." He pulled her closer, his arm tightening around her. "They were fools. You are the only whole thing I have ever known. Perfect, scared, stubborn, and perfect." Alara closed her eyes. She thought of the girl in the wagon, shaking with shame. She thought of the woman who had stood on the cliff with a rifle. They were the same person, forged in the fire of this man's love and her own will to survive. She wasn't ruined. She was just beginning. "I love you, Mountain Man," she whispered. "I love you, Beaten Bride," he teased gently, reclaiming the name and robbing it of its power. Outside, the mountain stood watch, silent and eternal. Inside, two survivors slept in the dark, their breath mingling, their hearts beating a defiant rhythm against the silence of the world that had tried to break them. They had won. Thank you for journeying with me through the snow and the heartache of this Wild West love story. It has been a pleasure to walk these muddy streets and high trails with you. I would love to know where you are listening from today. Are you in the shadow of the mountains or the middle of a city? Please leave a comment below. If you enjoyed this tale of survival and romance, please consider subscribing to From Wild West for more stories of the frontier. And please, share your thoughts on Alara and Elias's journey in English. I read every one. Until next time, keep your powder dry,